And thanks, Ajinda. So, okay, so obviously we all know the title for the day is actually Maritime Security, Geo-strategic Challenges and the Stability of the ASEAN Region. So this is the fourth of our 5 masterclass series. The next masterclass being 2 Saturdays from now. Okay, so I'm Danny Yong. I'm CEO of Kiniacademy. We are, let me tell you a bit about Kiniacademy, for those of you who don't know yet. So Kiniacademy is actually the training arm for Malaysia Kini. And we are mainly involved with journalism training. So we support journalism in learning and development and also investigative journalism. Yeah, so we've been working on that a fair bit, and we've been giving out small grants for reporting. And of course, we like the idea of promoting collaboration between ASEAN newsrooms. So there's a rumor out there that the ASEAN newsrooms do not talk to each other enough. So this is one of the aims of the project. So moving on. The sponsors for this project. So obviously, this is a really useful project for most of us, and we thank Institute of War and Peace Reporting, IWPR, for sponsoring this. IWPR works out of the UK, yeah, and they have an office in Manila and the US that we work with. All right, they are the one responsible for sponsoring and paying for all of this wonderful things that we're doing. Yeah. So on C4, you may have heard C4 stands for Southeast Asia Forum for Reporting. So this is really put together for the purpose of the reporters. Okay, and when we're talking about collaboration, C4's aim, one of the main aim is really to encourage a collaboration. So we're finding 2 overlaps here in our approach to collaboration. So we find all you journalists who are reporting from the same desks. So there are more relevance and more overlap in the things that you do, in the stories that you write. So when you see all of those in the chat, which I will add you in the WhatsApp chat, yeah, you can easily reach across to different borders to collaborate with other journalists. And the second area of overlap is, of course, the subject matter. Therefore, the subject matter for masterclass is really on ASEAN-related topics. So that's something that affects us all, okay? And ultimately, we love for this to be something sustainable that we can repeat over and over again. And for you guys, you journalists, to continue to collaborate. And, you know, when 9 months down the line, 6 months down the line, when you're working on a story, just reach out across to, you know, other phone numbers in the WhatsApp message, yeah, WhatsApp group. Okay, next, please. So C4 actually has got a few components to it. The main component is, of course, the masterclass. So we have 5. Today's masterclass is the 4th, okay? And that forms the spine of the series. And it also provides the content for you guys to write on. Second component is actually a reporting project. So each publisher that works with us actually have a grant to work on a story project. And those of you who haven't got a story project or haven't started working on that or haven't pitched to us your story project, please do so. And the third is really for this to be a forum, for there to be many conversations going on between all of us, including between the journalists and the speakers. We are looking to have these speakers be your source, actually, for a story on maritime security, for instance, for now and in the future as well. So this is when you get to know your sources too, for future reference as well. So next, please. Okay, so we have Dr.Asyura Salleh, who's going to hold the masterclass together. So we do in our typical format is we have somebody like her to hold the context together. We make sure we have somebody like her to ensure that the topic talked about stays relevant and current and newsworthy. All right, and we do try to have all our speakers to be from ASEAN, so we hear ASEAN voices. and in the discussion. So there's Ristian from Indonesia, Ahmad from the United Nations General Assembly, the legal advisor. So he'll give us that perspective, and Dr. Tan. All right. So I'll leave Asyura to introduce them to you later. Okay. Next, please. So I've already mentioned to some of you that please put your name of your organization in front of your name or behind your name so that we can identify who you are. And we encourage you to leave your video on. Yeah, we definitely will keep your mics on mute, but there'll be times where we also ask for questions. We enjoy a free flow of questioning as well. So do keep your mics on mute until then. All right. As I mentioned, we love questions. We love for you to get these speakers to answer your questions and to give you the required content you want for your stories. You know that we're recording this session, and that's really it. We'll run about 3 hours, so we have breaks in between. Okay, Dr. Asyura will lead us through that. Next, please, Adit. So before we started, we actually got some of you to, we asked almost of you to fill up the poll to get some feeling about this subject matter before we move, before we start. So let's go. Let me announce the results. So we asked you guys, do you often cover issues relating to maritime security? 80% of you say sometimes, 20% say never. So that's not surprising because this particular issue is not super relevant to some of you. Yeah, and imagine those who are in the Mekong region, for instance, they may not have, they don't have a direct waterway that impacts them. And a lot of the things that's happening is in the South China Sea as well. So moving on. How familiar are you with the legal dimensions of maritime security threats? Most of you say you're not very familiar, and again, that's really quite expected. This is quite a complex issue, and it's something that goes back long time. Whether it's 11 line, 11 dash line, and 9 dash line, and everything else that goes with it. Move on. How important is the domain of maritime security in your country? 60% of you say kinda. 40% say it's quite important. In your opinion, what is the biggest maritime security issue in your country? Surprisingly, 60% said it's ecological issue. Right? We hope Dr. Asyura can shed some light on that. Yeah, and the rest talks about it being a piracy, smuggling, and human trafficking issue. So surprisingly, there's nobody who said there is a war or warlike risk. Yeah, surprise. Move. Thanks. To what degree does your country collaborate with other Southeast Asian countries to ensure regional maritime security? So one each said that it's kind of fair and a lot, and 20% and 40% say that it's not. They don't collaborate a lot. Again, it's not surprising. Yeah. Let me just introduce quickly Dr. Asyura Salleh. She is a co-founder for Global Awareness and Impact Alliance, GAIA. She herself is an adjunct professor or non-resident Vasey Research Fellow for the Pacific Forum and a special advisor on maritime security for the Yokosuka Council on Asia-Pacific Affairs, YCAPS. Right? Her policy experience lies in her work for the UNODC Global Maritime Crime Program, Stable Seas, and Brunei Prime Minister's Office. That's really specialized, isn't she? Dr. Asyura has a research interest in maritime security in the Asia Pacific, with a focus on transnational maritime crime and maritime governance. So she's gained a master's in war studies from King's College London and earned a doctorate in international relations from the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. So Dr. Asyura, I look forward to your presentation.
Thanks very much, Danny, and very good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin, I'd like to really thank the organizers of Kiniacademy for this opportunity to moderate this masterclass on maritime security, geostrategic challenges, and the stability of the ASEAN region. As Danny introduced, my name is Dr. Asyura, or Asyura is fine. I'm delighted to be your keynote speaker and also your moderator for today. So I'm going to try and pull this up and hopefully it works. Okay, so as Danny mentioned, as we move throughout this whole masterclass for today, I'd be really delighted to hear your thoughts and your comments. So please prod and question all things maritime security with me. Feel free to use the chat box and I'll try my very best to include your thoughts in the conversations that we will be holding. Bear in mind that I and the other speakers do come from a policy and academic background. And so the insights that we bring to you guys are really based on these perspectives. But you as journalists and coming from the media, you guys bring a unique set of lens to the table as well. So I'd be very excited to learn from you, as I hope you'd be learning from us as well. So what I hope to do here today is really begin by setting the lay of the land to kind of prepare ourselves as we hear from our guest speakers. In my speech, I will be addressing the geographic parameters of maritime Southeast Asia. We'll then discover how each zone is unique to itself and even highlight key threats and key actors within these zones. Hopefully this will provide us the framework that we will need, which we can use as a guiding tool to help us better conceptualize and think about maritime security and really uncover the real, gripping questions that need to be asked. This would then give us a really good starting ground to delve deeper as we hear from the guest speakers who would be addressing geopolitics and strategy, we'll be talking about the role of ASEAN, and last but not least, the South China Sea dispute. Okay, so this is us here in maritime Southeast Asia. I chose this map to consciously avoid distinctions between state boundaries and to really remind us of what we inherently are. We are a maritime region. We are nestled here in the southeast portion of the Asia continent. And if you see, the countries all kind of revolve around the third largest island in the world, which is Borneo Island. And so if we place Borneo here as the center of gravity, we will see that each of these water bodies are defined by really different characteristics. These are defined by the shape of the water body, the countries that border this particular waterway, and even the geographical nature of it. And in doing so, these features really shape the uniqueness of the threats that take place in each water body, and so therefore also shape the response of countries surrounding these water bodies. A really good example for us to think about and using this framework is if we were to look, for example, at the Andaman Sea. The Andaman Sea here stretches towards the south of Myanmar and has a connection with the northern bit of the Bay of Bengal. It flows against Thailand, flows against Malaysia, and then it kind of ends at the tip of Aceh before falling into the Strait of Malacca. And because of this unique geographical position, the main maritime security issue that we are seeing in this particular maritime zone is severe migration or irregular migration, where lots of Rohingyas we're seeing are fleeing persecution from political spillovers in Myanmar. And as we move closer to the center of gravity, we've got the Strait of Malacca here, which really at its closest point is just a half-an-hour journey by a pump boat. And it provides, because despite this narrowest waterway, it provides an entry for commercial vessels and global trade to enter the rest of Southeast Asia and reach other parts of the world. And obviously, because of this feature, this immense level of high traffic naturally attracts a lot of armed robbery. And for this reason, we've got countries in this particular area banding together to form the Malacca Straits Patrol in an attempt to reduce these armed robbery incidents. If we move further along, we've got the Gulf of Thailand, the Natuna Sea, the broader South China Sea, Sula and Salba Seas. We've got Timor-Leste as well, which has its issues of illegal fishing. And we also have this little sliver of water here called the Java Sea. Each and every one of these maritime zones, if you think about it in this way, are all very unique in their own way, but yet they also share similar characteristics, as really and truly they are all inherently connected to one another. The way I look at where we stand here in this region, it's not that we are sitting here, I'm sitting here in my apartment on an extension of land that happens to be bordering seas. No, but rather we are on land that is taking up space on what should actually be a region completely inundated with water. We are surrounded by water, not that we're bordering them. So if we take this geographical perspective of Southeast Asia, we'll see that this has actually shaped the historical and ongoing dynamics of the region. This particular location has transformed Southeast Asia into a crossroads. Back in the day, we'd be taught in primary school how Southeast Asia is famed as the Spice Islands, where traders from all around the world crossed the treacherous journey from the Indian Ocean and from China, really congregating in this particular region. And so there are key routes that remain as dominant as they were then. This would be the Malacca Strait, we've got the Sunda Strait, and here we have the Celebes Seas as well, forming choke points across specific spots in the region. And when we talk about choke points, we're looking at the narrowest waterways between two bordering pieces of land. And so this really only means that if a blockade were to happen, there was a security issue and these choke points were blocked, what would happen is that global trade could be easily held hostage. So here, for example, as much as around 80% of China's oil imports pass through the Straits of Malacca every single year. But the region's geography, as we have seen, is making it into this melting pot. We're filled with people, as we can see here in this forum, with people from all cultures, all language and religion. Interestingly enough, even beneath our seas are as diverse as well. There are some pretty important areas which I feel need better protection, which is why we have marine protected areas. Danny did allude to the fact that in the poll results that were held earlier, ecological issues were actually one of the main maritime security concerns. And this is something I would strongly echo, considering that especially in areas like Sulu Sea and even in the areas north of Borneo, like the Spratly Seas, these are rich marine biodiverse areas, home to coral reefs and a whole host of fish species. So much so that the South China Sea supplies 12% of global fish catch. But our human activities and how we are using our seas are really damaging what's happening beneath it. We've got artificial island construction, which are seen by some as an attempt to exercise sovereign rights in the area. And this has really impacted our coral reefs. Dredgers would scrape the seabed. They would gather gravel in order to build these artificial islands. And in doing so, they damage the coral reefs that we need to hold the seabed down and to protect us from larger waves. These coral reefs are really unlikely to recover in the next 10 years or so ahead of us. So we are really facing a massive environmental crisis. So that's Maritime Southeast Asia. We've seen how its geographical location really shapes the history of the region and then develops these dynamics that Maritime Southeast Asia continues to operate within up till today. Its legacy of being a spice island continues, where Malaysia, for example, in its White Defense paper released a few years ago, continues to uphold this legacy of being a connective region. Malaysia had crafted its role as a bridging linchpin between the Indian Ocean and the Asia Pacific region. This does emphasize Malaysia's critical location, but it also pays homage to Southeast Asia's starting premise as a connective region to the rest of the world. And so within this context, there are, as I alluded to, a variety of concerns. We've got hard security issues, and we also have non-traditional issues as well. When we talk about hard security issues, we'll be talking about, I think one of the results was, one of a particular concern was war-like risks. And this would then fall under a hard security issue because it would refer to geopolitical concerns with significant national sovereignty implications. So I mentioned earlier artificial island building, that would be one of them. We've also got freedom of navigation operations and other strategies, which I think Andy would be able to develop a bit more. On the other hand, we did see that 60% from the poll results indicated that ecological issues is a major concern. The region is beset with other environmental and what we call non-traditional concerns. We've got illegal trafficking. Here you can see a crocodile, and we've also got overfishing. illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing is a particular series of crimes, and overfishing would fall underneath this particular category. We can definitely expand into this later on. But the main takeaway points are: one, it's important to remember that maritime security is always an extension of developments on land. Political instability, economic recession, and even as we see unequal distribution of resources amongst communities on land are all key drivers of the maritime security threats that we are seeing at sea. So when we do see a particular concern that takes place at sea, bear in mind that these are only symptoms of a larger problem that is taking place on land. And so to preserve maritime security would require us to really go onto land and counter the main driving root causes. The second main takeaway point is that because of the nature of the region that we all live and operate in, these problems are so inherently unique to each maritime zone, as we saw with the Andaman Sea and the Strait of Malacca and even the Sulu and South Seas. But yet these problems are also very closely linked and intertwined with one another, because one particular issue will definitely have a repercussion and impact other issues around it as well. We can use the Natuna Sea, for example, as a case where it is known to be a marine region with rich biodiversity. But because of this richness in its fish and its underwater life, it's also led to illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, IUU fishing. This has then led to sparking national sovereignty concerns, especially as we're seeing more and more foreign fishing vessels in this area. But yet the overfishing and the activities that these vessels are doing are actually preventing the fish from moving to other parts of the region. And so what it is doing is it is upsetting the broader ecosystem of marine life in South China Sea. So we've very broadly reviewed the phenomena of maritime security. We've looked at the unique geographical characteristics. We've looked at some threats. The next question is, who is driving maritime security, right? Who's behind it? Who do we go to try get answers from? So when we think of main players, or rather when I think of main players in maritime security, I pull up this mind map. I'm like, okay, we've got extra regional players. We've got the UK, the US, Australia, China, and we've also then have also Southeast Asian maritime states, right? And how can we then interlink the national security interests with one another? Is one particular country playing more of a role than the other? And if so, why? And then we look at other initiatives as well. For example, if there is a commonly perceived threat in a very small specified region, like in the Straits of Malacca, we would likely see minilateral mechanisms set up just between those countries. Meanwhile, we have multilateral exercises, and these have to do with developing the capacity of countries here in the region. Countries can participate in these exercises. They will learn how to visit, board, search, and seize a particular ship. But really and truly, if you were to look at the way these different groupings are taking place, they have symbolism that really shift the narrative surrounding major power competition in this region. And then there's trust, which needs to be built between our neighbors. Here, this mostly takes place through information sharing initiatives. Some of it take place at the regional level with the IFC, Information Fusion Center in Singapore. Some of it take place at the national level between agencies in Indonesia, like I think the Indonesian Maritime Information Center. And so we also then have ASEAN, last but not least, where here we see a lot of regional dialogues taking place. And this we will hear later from one of our guest speakers, who will further talk about the role of ASEAN and what kind of role it plays in developing dialogue around key issues that matter, like the code of conduct, or even here, maritime transport. We also can't forget our environmental issues, and these are groups based around certain themes. Most of the approach taken when it comes to ecosystem issues are very evidence-based, so it's based on heavy scientific research. This is mostly driven by SEFDEC. But these aren't just the only players, when it comes to maritime security. I think we are neglecting the non-state actors. I mean, their interests matter too. We have the coastal communities that are often the first to suffer from any maritime security concern. The stateless Bajau people that live in the Sulu Sea, or even the fishes that have to move further out into the seas because the fish that they once used to fish are now decimated. We also have the interest of politically driven groups that pose a threat of kidnapping for ransom, like the Abu Sayyaf group in the Sulu Sea. And we also have commercial vessels, right, and passenger ships that ply the seas of Southeast Asia, and they make up the shipping and transport industry. They play as important a role in maritime security because they can either fall victim to these threats, or they can participate in building security by sharing information on any attacks or any threats that they are seeing while they happen to be there. So it's really important to recognize, I think, that maritime security really has more to do with people, which very closely dictates the direction of regional stability because of the very intimate connection that we have with our seas and how the seas shape our national security. Okay, so I thought that, having said all that, we could just kind of think about how we can reflect this in the media. I had to think about my past media engagements, and I was thinking about how we could really change the way narrative in the media is being built around maritime security. I laid out several guidance points, which I think it'd be really great to get your thoughts on. The first bit is, as I mentioned earlier, maritime security is always an extension of developments on land. This applies to everything that we see at sea, from the degradation of our coral reefs to developing security arrangements. And so when developing a story, I would encourage you to try situate whatever you're seeing out there, a developing phenomena, within this land-sea nexus relationship. Aside from merely observing or providing a description of an incident at sea, it's important to question what the driving factors on land were. And so by resolving the factors that we see, would this then result or reflect lower levels of threat at sea? And the second point, which I feel is very closely tied to the first, is that we also need to recognize the actors. I mentioned earlier, when we think about major actors in maritime security, we have this huge continuum of regional actors, the countries that are playing a role, information sharing. We've got the naval forces, the Coast Guard forces. We also have the coastal communities. But think of this continuum and then flip it and work from bottom up. Because at the end of the day, the main question is, how does whatever you're seeing at sea impact your security, impact my security, and our security as a region? What more can other actors do when alleviating threats at sea? It's important to think about what kind of capacities do we need to give to these actors to give them more agency, to be more accountable and be more responsive to the threats taking place. And because of this, I thought to mention that maritime security isn't really just the responsibility of policymakers, but it really is our duty as well. A simple case in point is this very dialogue that we're having here today, where you as the media, as the journalists, have actually recognized this gap in needing to link both factual observations with a better understanding of the deeper dynamics that our guest speakers will be sharing later on. I think it's important to also take into account that maritime security is a social, it's a political, it's a security issue. Policy decisions that are made at the higher levels all have repercussions that transcend all the way down to impact coastal communities, defense budgets, and also the green sea turtle. And so by looking at it this way, maritime security has more than enough space as a field, as a theme, to hold more actors accountable in better protecting our seas. But maritime security is also broad enough for these same actors to fall victim if they are unable to be accountable for what they see at sea. I think it's also important, as we talk about creating this space of accountability, to look into this whole process of agenda setting. It's important to think about how are certain issues granted priority on the national agenda. Is the extent of the crisis that we see at sea, is it reflected accurately in the policies that are being taken, the strategies that are being adopted? Is a particular issue overstated by these policymakers, or are they understated? Is there not enough attention given to them? And so what are the obstacles behind this? How are all the interests of the maritime security actors taken into consideration as executive decisions are being made? And so at the end of the day, I think that you as journalists are as important as all the other actors participating in this very complex medley of preserving maritime security. And because of its fluidity and its all-encompassing nature, maritime security is often seen as this high-level ivory tower issue, right? Maybe we don't have much relevance to it. But in actuality, maritime security has very much to do with you and with I. However, the narrative that we've been using so far in constructing this field has prevented us from closely engaging with this topic, primarily due to the heavy jargon that is often used or the high-level nature of the meetings and the arrangements that we often see. And so what matters is to be able to deconstruct the jargon that we encounter, break that up, figure out the implication of each term that's being used, look into the context of which the term is being used, and broaden the spotlight shift it from all these high-level meetings, and also think about the symbolism that these meetings have for other interests and for other issues taking place in maritime security. And I feel this way we can get a very thoughtful and sharply framed observation that is impactful, not just for the policymakers, but also for the average reader that interacts with your story. The main thing I think that we need to depart with is that the hook that you use that we use when trying to develop a piece on my writing is to really recognize that maritime security first and foremost has to do with survival, the need to rely on the seas for a livelihood, for economic gains, for the protection of sovereignty. And by recognizing this banal human instinct, I think we'd be able to recognize that maritime security is so intimately tied to our future welfare. And therefore, that creates the obligation for us to better interact with this field. I'd say don't be deterred with this ivory tower perception of maritime security, but use your empathy, use your compassion to delve deep into the dynamics of maritime security. I think this way we can keep the field relevant and also hold more actors accountable for their activities at sea. So I hope this gives us some foundational pillars and a framework on how we can interact with this field, especially as we head towards the thematic issues that our guest speakers will be addressing. I want to thank you all for your attention, and it'd be really great to hear your perspectives on this particular framework that I've put forth. And if you've got any questions, let's do that before we reach our next session. Great. So we've got some questions in the chat. And here it says, you spoke about the way in which maritime security issues are affected by issues on land. How do social attitudes, ideas, and ideologies, example, nationalism or attitudes to gender, affect maritime security? I think this is a really good question. And if you are in the crowd, feel free to unmute your mic. I think it'd be really great to hear from you if you want to expand on this. Oh, that was it. Okay, great.
Me, yeah. But what I meant was because you were talking about, I might as well speak. You were talking about how it's an extension of an issue that takes place on land. So, and we tend to talk about issues in terms of events and things like that. But I'm talking about, if you're thinking about the realm of ideas, then how does an ideology, which is a mental conception, affect what's taking place on a maritime level?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's a brilliant question, and in fact, we're already seeing how this is being played out in our region. I think Dr. Thanh would be able to expand more on how nationalism drives a certain angle towards a state's behavior at sea. But in terms of gender, I think a very good case in point is the Angels of the Sea, which is a term referred to a unique, special set of women Coast Guard forces that are known to be able to have deterred foreign vessels by just really using their broadcast speaker and encouraging these vessels to leave the area. And this is known to be successful because the role of a woman is thought to engender maternal instincts that would want to deter men from pushing their vessels further into traditional territorial waters. And so I think by looking at gender this way, it's really interesting how it has actually shaped a particular form of deterrence. Whether or not this particular force is successful would be another issue, but it has been known to apparently be able to deter, or vessels have known to have left that area when this force was in operation. So that is definitely a particular example of how attitudes to gender and how women are, what role of women play in maritime law enforcement can affect a state's behavior at sea. Do we have any other questions? Oh, cool. So we've got Haris. Haris, if you want to speak, you can go ahead.
Hi, Doctor. Haris Mohammed here from Lishikini.
Hi.
Okay, just curious because you mentioned about, media coverage is important on maritime security, but I think all this while many times that when the media are reporting on maritime security, it always rely on the official version or because the media is not largely present, at the maritime side. So what do you think of this? Do you think that, especially at this side of the world, and now we have a very, volatile situation between China and United States, and things, I think that we need more media presence, to do first-hand observation rather than relying on official versions of what's happening and things like that. Thank you.
I think that's a very good point. I think Andy and I attended the Shangri-La dialogue, and I do recall having a whole host of cameras and the whole media right behind me trying to capture the proceedings as they took place. So in some cases, I am aware that there is a media presence, but more often than not, there aren't. And this is definitely, I think, a gap which needs to be addressed. I feel that more transparency needs to take place across the region so we can better really understand the environment that we are operating in. But having said that, if we were to work with what we have now, I would encourage maybe the media to really look at the keywords that are being used and see where else they have appeared in official statements and in what context. I think it's important to maybe also go a step further and talk to experts on the ground who are very intimately tied to this, not just the foreign policy makers, but what we call the think tankers or the Track 2. These are people who are very, very closely linked to the policy world, but they're also a bit more confident to actually share their analysis and their opinions as well. So thanks very much for that question. Okay, so without further ado, let's get our hands dirty and let's look into the different thematic areas. We will first begin by hearing from Ristian Atriandi Supriyanto, who will be speaking on geopolitics and strategy in the South China Sea. Ristian Atriandi Supriyanto is an Indonesian presidential PhD scholar with the Strategic and Defense Studies Center at the Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs at the Australian National University. Before joining ANU, he was an Associate Research Fellow with the Maritime Security Program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore, and he was also a researcher with the Department of International Relations at the University of Indonesia. His research interests cover maritime security, Australia-Indonesia relations, and Indonesia's strategic policy. Andy holds a Master of Science in Strategic Studies from RSIS and a Bachelor of Social Science in International Relations from the University of Indonesia. So Andy, over to you. Feel free to share your slide.
Thank you, Asyura, and thank you for the tour de force that you just did. I think it was very illuminating in the way you lay out all the maritime security issues that we should cover. And you rightly pointed out that hard security issues are no less important than other issues. It's also interesting when we look at the survey that none of the participants see war or warlike risks are relevant to their countries. But I hope, though, that my presentation will persuade you otherwise. Okay, so let me try to get this word. Can you see my slide now?
Yeah, we can.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the Kiniacademy for giving me the opportunity to present on this topic. In this presentation, I will explain the geostrategic dimension of maritime security in Southeast Asia. I have 4 guiding questions that will guide my presentation and our discussions later. First is why is geostrategy relevant to maritime security? How is it related to defense and military issues? What are the main defense and military issues in Southeast Asia's maritime security? And finally, why and how should the media, journalists, keep pace with and report on these defense and military issues? So to answer the first question, that is the relevance of geostrategy to maritime security, we must first know what we are talking about. People like to use the word geostrategy like a password or even a cool word. But what does it actually mean? So we have this professor, American professor, Jacob Grigiel. He defines geostrategy is simply the geographic direction of a country's foreign policy. It is where a state concentrates its efforts by projecting military power and diplomatic resources. How does geostrategy relate to maritime security? Well, I just simply add, this military power and diplomatic resources are directed to secure a state's maritime domain. The South China Sea is a good example to illustrate why geostrategy is relevant to maritime security. So in the South China Sea, states are competing to employ military and diplomatic resources to gain and maintain access and control of the sea and any features therein. Maritime access means rights of sea and air passage through the area of the sea, whereas control means sovereignty or ownership of the maritime area or the insular features within that area. By understanding geostrategy, you will understand how countries utilize their military and diplomatic resources to access and control part of the oceans they claim as theirs. When we look at this map, there is nothing that suggests competition is underway. The South China Sea only exists in different shades of blue. We give these different shades their peculiar meaning: political, diplomatic, legal, or otherwise. How much you want to access and control this sea, it's entirely up to you. But you cannot have all this sea to yourself. Otherwise, you'll end up fighting other countries. That's why in the past 50 years or so, countries have agreed to regulate how much they can control the maritime domain, including through what we now call the United Nations Law of the Sea that came to being in 1982. But then you'll have this, for instance. Some of you might already know what this is. China has its own interpretation of how much maritime area it can claim in the South China Sea. To put it bluntly, maritime security for China is the condition in which other countries have accepted whatever China thinks is its rightful ownership within this 9-dash line. China's geostrategy is basically how China directs its military and non-military resources to make other countries accept China's access and its control in the South China Sea. But China is not alone in trying to obtain control of the area. Some countries that border the South China Sea have their own political and legal interpretations of what constitutes their control. Some of these interpretations do overlap, which resulted in the red dash line on the map. these overlapping areas thus becomes a maritime security problem of its own, and countries develop their own geostrategies to secure what they regard as their maritime area of control. Sometimes the geostrategies of these countries collide, which make threats of conflicts very real. We now move to the second question. How is geostrategy related to defense and military issues? Simply put, the easiest way you can defend what you claim is to fortify it with your military units. You place combat aircraft and warships on patrol in and around your maritime domain to intimidate other countries from taking what you claim is yours. And this is a classic exercise of a concept in maritime strategy called sea control. As the name suggests, sea control is basically your ability to use the sea, because you don't control the sea for the sake of controlling it. You want to use it for a medium of transportation or to extract resources from it. But more importantly, sea control is also about your ability to deny other countries from using the sea itself. You want your access and control to the sea exclusive to you only. So you try to exclude others by using coercion or intimidation. At the same time, you also don't want to start a war while denying others from using your part of the sea. This is where you apply what is called gray zone tactics. That is the use of non-military units, coast guards, or fishing fleets to support what are essentially defense or military purposes. At the same time, the South China Sea is not only the concern of the countries that bordered it. As you can see, the red and yellow lines on the map, the South China Sea is located along the world's major shipping routes. So the South China Sea becomes a stake, not only for Southeast Asian countries and China, but also all other countries that use it for commercial or military purposes. So of course, when some countries try to control the South China Sea, it can curtail the freedom of the other countries that are also accessing it. One of those countries that challenges any exclusive control of South China Sea is the United States of America. America believes that some of the countries bordering the South China Sea, especially China, control more area of the sea than what they are entitled to under international law. So the United States is acting like a global policeman in trying to curtail what it regards as China's quote-unquote excessive maritime claims. The US is doing this through what it's called the Freedom of Navigation Operations, or FONOPs. FONOPs are basically movements or maneuvers of US Navy ships in parts of the South China Sea, like in this picture. US warship passes through a circle that China has claimed as its own waters, as if to express US defiance of China's exclusive control of the area. But at the same time, FONOPs are also controversial. Firstly, because the US itself has not ratified the UN law of the sea. So basically a policeman who doesn't agree to the letter of the law. Secondly, FONOPs are deliberately provocative. What if in one of these operations, China decided to confront US warship head-on by physical collision? That would certainly result in overt escalation. Now, the third question, what are the main defense and military issues pertaining to Southeast Asia's maritime security? Thus far, I have used the South China Sea to exemplify the relevance of geostrategy to defense and military issues in Southeast Asia's maritime security context. But there are many other issues that can also have defense and military implications for Southeast Asian countries. We can distinguish these issues according to the main players or perpetrators, namely non-government and government perpetrators. Non-government perpetrators, for instance, are mainly responsible for illegal fishing or maritime poaching. But the two distinctions can also blur. As I explained, gray zone tactics can utilize illegal fishing to support a government's ability to control a given maritime area, which is essentially a military objective. Just to illustrate my point earlier, one important issue that recently came up is the new military partnership, not alliance, but partnership between Australia, Britain, and America called AUKUS. When they announced AUKUS last month, their leaders didn't even mention a single word of China. Although nearly everyone understands that AUKUS is targeted at China itself. What makes AUKUS highly controversial is the decision by America to equip Australia with 8 nuclear submarines to be armed with long-range land attack cruise missiles. I will show you the illustration later. Some Southeast Asian countries voiced their concerns at this initiative. They feared that arming Australia with nuclear submarines will only accelerate arms race in the region and further raise the risk of what is called nuclear proliferation. That is the transfer of nuclear weapons to those countries that have yet to possess them. Now, as journalists, you can take up and report on this issue in several critical ways. The trend that I can see from the reporting in Southeast Asia and the reception of AUKUS is that they criticize AUKUS itself, especially the part on arms race and nuclear proliferation. You can emphasize what the Malaysian and Indonesian governments are saying, as shown on the screen. Arms race, tension, aggression. So all in all, AUKUS is basically counterproductive to the security and stability of Southeast Asia. However, there are other ways to critically report the story by scrutinizing the details of the arguments that both the proponents and critics of AUKUS are trying to promote. I can cite 3 examples. First, you can question the basis of arms race. Is AUKUS the cause of regional arms race, or is AUKUS only a symptom of an arms race that is already underway? Secondly, you can try to discover the Australian motivations in acquiring nuclear submarines and long-range strike missiles. We know that China is behind AUKUS, is behind the trigger for AUKUS, but why does Australia specifically need nuclear submarines and long-range missiles to counter China? Third example, you can explore the risk of nuclear proliferation and ask whether by acquiring these submarines, will Australia develop nuclear weapons of its own? I'll tackle these questions in our next and final question. So now, why and how should the media report on defense and military issues concerning Southeast Asian maritime security? It's simply because defense and military issues are often laden with political agenda to masquerade national geostrategies. As journalists, your job, and in fact your social responsibility, is to reveal government's intentions behind their statements, behind their public statements and policies. So back to our AUKUS example. As I explained before, we have 3 examples to scrutinize further the arguments that proponents and critics of AUKUS have set. The first example is whether AUKUS is the cause or only the symptom of a regional arms race. For those of you who are not familiar with an arms race, an arms race is basically the competition between two or more countries to acquire weapons in response to one another's acquisitions. Take the acquisition of submarines, for example. According to 2010 estimates, so 11 years ago, China will add 18 submarine boats. You refer to submarines in reporting, it's not vessels or ships. No matter how large they are called boats. 18 boats by 2025. In fact, this is the largest increase among all the countries on the map. So it begs the question, does AUKUS trigger an arms race? Or is it China's geostrategy that actually sparks Australia, Britain, and America to initiate AUKUS in the first place? This brings us to the second way of reporting on AUKUS. How can we discover Australia's motivations in joining AUKUS and acquiring nuclear submarines? More specifically, why did Australia choose submarines, but not other types of weapons when announcing AUKUS? You could argue, for example, that Australia had agreed on a submarine deal with France in 2016, but the project was already troubled by cost overruns and lengthy delays. So AUKUS provided Australia with a convenient escape from its troubled submarine deal with France. Finally, there is the argument that Australia can manufacture nuclear weapons once it receives nuclear-powered submarines from America or Britain. You could argue nuclear-powered submarines, or what military analysts call as SSN, as you can see on the screen. SSNs are vastly different in shape and form from nuclear-armed ballistic missile submarines, or SSBN, the top type of submarine. As you can see on the slide, it's simply impossible to convert SSN, for instance, the Los Angeles class, into the Ohio class SSBN, because they are totally two different beasts altogether, made for different purposes. How about the alternative then? Since Australia is not just going to acquire nuclear submarines, but also Tomahawk cruise missiles, long-range land attack cruise missiles. Can Australia replace the warhead? The warhead is the white tip at the front of the missile with nuclear payload. The answer is yes, Australia can do that, but that still doesn't explain why Australia needs nuclear submarines. Nuclear Tomahawks can be carried on regular warships, even conventional submarines and fighter aircraft. Australia doesn't need nuclear submarines just to carry Tomahawks. Besides, nuclear Tomahawks are no longer in service with the US Navy, who are going to provide and supervise nuclear submarines for Australia. All nuclear weapons at sea nowadays are carried by ballistic missiles. In other words, SSBN, not the kind of SSNs that Australia is going to acquire. To conclude, we have covered the 4 questions as follows. First, geostrategy is relevant to maritime security because it provides us with insights into a state's policies to gain access and control of the maritime domain. Second, geostrategy also explains the defense and military focus in maritime security, such as why countries militarize and fortify their maritime claims. Thirdly, defense and military issues can concern government and non-government actors alike, but the two can easily blur. For instance, illegal fishing in the South China Sea, which are carried out by fishermen, but it serves Chinese government's purpose of enforcing control of the claim. Finally, your knowledge of geostrategy can add depth to your reporting of defense and military issues, such as AUKUS. I have some caveats, however, when you report on military and defense issues on maritime security. Firstly, I beg you not to consult the Global Firepower Index for military statistics, because Global Firepower Index is non-authoritative and untraceable as to its sources. It's like the Wikipedia for military analysts. Get your data instead from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, or IISS, or the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI. You can Google them, and they have authoritative data with clear sources as to where they get their statistics from. Secondly, be mindful of military jargons and lexicons that can deceive you, such as the difference between nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed submarines. One can ask, for instance, whether nuclear propulsion, that is nuclear power, for a war machine like a submarine constitutes peaceful usage of nuclear energy. Finally, when listening to government defense and strategic policy announcements and statements, make sure you not only read between the lines, but also listen to what I call listen to the silence. Sometimes words are deliberately unspoken of to convey a special meaning. For example, the Indonesian government's official response to AUKUS only addresses the issue of Australian nuclear submarines, but the word AUKUS itself is absent in the official statement. So you need to ask, is there a hidden meaning in the fact that the word AUKUS is left unsaid in the official statement of Indonesia? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andy. I thought that was really, really helpful in really breaking down the importance of geostrategy to the region. You highlighted several strategies that we could use to gain access and control to the seas around us, like FONOPS, freedom of navigation operations, and also gray zone tactics. Then you really helped, I think, us break down the how we can logically question what we see out there. You know, look at underlying assumptions and really hold this up for questioning. You need to assess the motivations, the driving trends behind these strategies that we see, and even foreign policy considerations. So we've got a few minutes before we hit our break time, and let's see what kind of questions we have. In the meantime, I'd like to encourage everyone to share your thoughts, ask any questions, put them out in the chat, and then we'll be sure to address them. So Andy, you talked about jargon, lexicons, and reading between the lines. How do changes in terminology and reporting affect how we can perceive maritime security? It's the particular set of terms that governments love using over others.
Yes. I would like to cite the example that I repeated in my presentation when the three governments, Australia, Britain, and America, launched AUKUS. They kept insisting that the submarines are nuclear powered, are not nuclear armed. You know, there is no way Australia will acquire a nuclear arm. So it's basically saying that yes, submarines are a weapon, but at the same time they are a weapon for a peaceful purposes, for a defensive purposes. We are not changing. It's not a game changer in the area. You know, other countries have also acquired nuclear-powered submarines. So, so is Australia. So, it's a way of trying to preempt opposition from potential opposition from regional countries, and to gain acceptance of Australia's legitimate intention to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. Another example is the way America promotes freedom of navigation. The term freedom itself connotes that it is what everybody wants. You know, you want freedom of access to the South China Sea, which is important for international global shipping routes. So you should support us because we are defending freedom. We are maintaining freedom of access to this area, and any country that wants to impose exclusive control of that area should be opposed. You should join us, Americans, to oppose any attempts to make control of the sea exclusive. So there is a lot of so there is a lot of political packaging that comes into maritime security initiatives as they relate to military issues.
Thank you for that. I think it's important how you, I like how you ended your point on the way a particular strategy is packaged and framed with the right words.
Yeah, and I think it's also important this is where the critical role of journalists is try to unpack the hidden meaning of what is said and what is left unsaid in all these statements. Because, you know, military defense issues in maritime security especially, they are laden with a lot of political agendas, as I said, with vested political interests. So it is imperative for journalists to unpack them and for the public to know what's the real intention behind these statements and policies.
Definitely. We've got another question from Haris from Malaysia Kini, where you know, AUKUS is a symptom of an arms race that has already started. And can you give more examples of other symptoms which maybe media should be looking out for? How about ASEAN countries? So we're looking for indicators, Andy, of a potential arms race or response to it. What should we keep an eye out for?
Yeah, as I explained in the presentation, one indicator, I mean, it's the theoretical explanation for an arms race is very strict. You know, there should be an action-reaction cycle between two or more countries. There is a specific identification of who your enemy is and what kind of weapon your enemy is acquiring, and you know, you are responding to that. A clear example of this is, of course, between America and Russia during the Cold War, when they are trying to outmatch one another in their weapon systems. America is buying missiles, buying combat planes, whereas and at the same time, Soviet Union is also trying to catch up in trying to developing maybe not the number, but more importantly, a more advanced type of combat aircraft than America. So that's happening. But arms races can also be asymmetrical. You don't have to, two countries don't have to compete with the same weapon systems. You can compete on the basis of countermeasure to a weapon. So for instance, when America has a leading edge in the number and sophistication of aircraft carriers. China is also trying to catch up with aircraft carriers, but not to the same extent. But at the same time, China is developing anti-aircraft carrier weapons. So basically missiles, hypersonic missiles that can target and again that can hit American aircraft carriers when these warships are closing into Chinese coastlines. So these things are happening, but again, all this reflects respective national geostrategies of countries. You know, this is how countries trying to protect what they think is the legitimate idea of the maritime domain. For America, the legitimate idea is maintain access. You know, whatever China is doing in the South China Sea is illegitimate. China is opposed to it. On the other hand, is to the contrary. China wants to preserve its control. It wants to regulate who is coming and going through the portion of the sea that it claims as its own. So yeah, so I guess as journalists, and I think in the media, it's very important to cover both sides. What the two sides are trying to claim as rightfully theirs in their national geostrategies, and how these national strategies are implemented in defense and military terms.
Thank you so much, Andy. I think this has been a really good starter for us, primarily because, Andy, I think you highlighted the importance of us to really need to keep a lookout on how certain strategies or policies are framed and how it's being tied up in its political package. You have cautioned the journalists to look out for what is said and what is left unsaid as well, because policymakers have a tendency to carefully construct their words, their sentences, and to apply a very conscious use of particular terms. You mentioned freedom, for example. You mentioned nuclear powered, for example. So it's our role to try to figure out what the hidden meaning is behind the specific usage of these terms. In terms of really looking out for a future trend of geostrategy, you indicated that in addition to looking at emerging strategic arrangements such as AUKUS, we should also look at procurement patterns. How are the assets, the current assets that these states have, and the future procurement plans of these states? How will that determine geostrategy in the future, and also the types of foreign and defense policies that will be used by these competing states? But at the end of the day, I think you alluded that the base motivation for all competing parties will remain the same, despite the shifting in trends, the type of weapons and assets that we go out to purchase. And this is something that journalists will always need to go out and look for and constantly establish and reestablish what these motivations are, how are current procurement patterns reflecting them, and what can we expect in the near future. So thank you very much for that, Andy. That's been really, really
You're
great.
welcome.
And you brought us straight to the break time for that 10-minute breather for your toilet break or for some fresh air. So let's touch base again in 10 minutes, and we will hear the legal dimension of maritime security in this region. So thank you, everyone. Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome back. I hope you all had a good break, managed to stretch your legs out and grab that cup of coffee. We will now continue with our masterclass. Next we will hear from Dr. Ahmad Almaududy Amri, who will be speaking to us on the legal aspects of maritime security. I saw in the poll that actually on a scale of 1 to 5, there was a majority that actually ranked 3. So indicating that you have quite an existing moderate understanding of the legal nature of maritime security. That's great because I certainly don't. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Dr. Ahmad. So Dr. Ahmad Almaududy Amri is a diplomat from Indonesia. He works at the Research and Policy Planning Agency at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Indonesia. In 2010, he had successfully passed the highly competitive Junior Foreign Service course at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he was the youngest in his batch. That's really quite impressive. Dudy was also formerly a junior advocate at the MR&P law firm in Jakarta. He's a lawyer by training, having finished his Bachelor of Law from the University of North Sumatra in Indonesia. And he also holds 2 master's degrees, a Master of Laws degree from Gajah Mada University, which he finished in 2010, and a Master's in International Relations from the University of Indonesia, which he finished a year later. Dudy also holds the distinction of being the youngest graduate in both master's degrees. Very cool. So in 2012, he also received an Australian Leadership Award Scholarship from AusAid, and he was an intern at the Embassy of Indonesia in Canberra, Australia for quite a while, I think a year or so. Dudy also finished the diplomatic short course for junior diplomats at Klingendal Institute at The Hague in the Netherlands. So over to you, Dudy. We're really, really excited to hear what you have to say. And in the meantime, everyone, please make active use of the chat box. It'd be really, really great to hear your thoughts. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Asyura, for the kind introduction. And first of all, I would like to start by thanking Kiniacademy for this invitation that's extended to me. Also to share my thoughts and views regarding maritime security challenges in Southeast Asia. Of course, this is the topic that's being part of my PhD thesis as well. It was done in 2016 in Australia. And I will share my PowerPoint. Yeah, there it is. So thank you also Dr. Asyura and also Andy for laying out the basis of the discussion. And we have heard how the maritime security in Southeast Asia is actually really important, and how does the complexity of the region makes it more more interesting for us to discuss about. And I will try to see from a different angle regarding this topic, which is a legal aspect of it. And we will see that there are different elements that we will be discussing today. So the outline for today's presentation, the first one, I will talk about the complexity of the Southeast Asia region, how the maritime complexity is actually there in it and also exists in Southeast Asia, and then how actually maritime security is defined, the definition, how it is legally defined, when did it start, when did it started being used in international documents and so forth. And then, of course, we move forward to the maritime security challenges, the traditional versus non-traditional. So this is also a very interesting thing that we need to know. It's not merely piracy, not merely IU fishing, but also it could also involve states in resolving problems of this maritime security. And also I will touch upon the South China Sea dispute. I understand that the next speaker will also touch upon this, and also how Vietnam will view on the South China Sea. But my presentation regarding South China Sea will focus on the legal aspect of it. Also, we will also touch upon Indonesian position regarding South China Sea dispute. And after that, we will see how ASEAN is actually reacting towards these maritime security problems. What are the frameworks? What are the cooperations being developed in this organization? And also lastly, way forward. So complexity of the Southeast Asia region. First of all, it's very easy to see, the huge water area in this region makes it very complex. And there are a lot of major sea lanes for international navigations. We can see there is a Malacca Strait, also Lombok Strait, and also Sunda Straits, which are very important for trade. And then it's also the the Southeast Asia region is also very important in terms of geopolitics and geostrategic. And you already mentioned how important it is in terms of geostrategic. In geopolitics, it's very important, as you know, that there are different countries who wants to have influence in the region, not only China. Before also mentioned that the US also wants to be there, UK, Australia, because it's very important because the trade route is transverse in Southeast Asia, and it lies between Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean, and you can see between Asia and also Australia, so it makes it very important. And every state in Southeast Asia, except Laos, of course, has access to the sea. So, but even Laos itself also has interest also to the sea in Southeast Asia, because when you are in connection to the sea, then you will do activities along with it. So this is very important for countries in the area. And we can see that there are two largest archipelagic states. There is Indonesia, and also there is Philippines in the area, and major ports also here, Port of Singapore, Port Klang, and also Tanjung Priok. And thus we can conclude that sea has been used as a medium for exchange of goods, also exchange of news, and also ideas. So maybe for you journalists, this could be the basis why actually the complexity of the region makes it important for us to discuss about maritime security issues. And then maritime security definitions. Different scholars has their different approach to define what is maritime security. But to be frank, there is no precise definition for maritime security, and there is no global recognized definition. So it keeps on changing. It is based on the interest, based on politics, and also based on respective background of the scholars, respective backgrounds of the government, let's say, to how they want to shape the definition of this maritime security as terminology. And UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea itself, does not define what is maritime security all about, but it does regulate several maritime security challenges or threats. And thus, it is easier for us to make a distinction between maritime security challenges in traditional terms and also non-traditional terms. If you want to dig down in the UN process, we can see from the ICP, or the Informal Consultative Process on Ocean and Law of the Sea. In this process, which started in 2000, there is a report of the Secretary General on oceans and the law of the sea. But the start of this process does not mention anything about maritime security. What they mention is only about maritime safety. But then in 2002, this is the first time, the Kickstarter, where the terminology maritime security was being referenced in the document. And of course, maritime safety is still there along with maritime security. And in the 2020 ICP report, it mentioned about piracy and armed robbery, which are threats to maritime security. So for you journalists who wants to make reference about when maritime security definition actually first started, in the United Nations process, we can refer to this document ICP 2002. And then we can also look at the UN Secretary General's report on ocean and law of the sea in 2008 to know what are the elements of the maritime security. So maybe broadly, okay, we have mentioned, the UN have mentioned about maritime security, but what is maritime security all about? This report does not actually, this is not like an exhaustive list of what is maritime security, but this is one of the references that being referred to in 2008. UN Secretary General mentions all these elements which may constitute maritime security. So as we can see, the first is piracy and armed robbery against ships. And then second, you can see terrorist acts involving shipping, and then offshore installation and other maritime interests, illicit traffic in arms and weapons of mass destruction, illicit traffic in narcotics, drugs, and substances, smuggling and trafficking of persons by sea, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. As we know, this is the IUU fishing, and then international and unlawful damage to the marine environment. And then we can see the differences between traditional and non-traditional challenges to maritime security. Traditional is quite simple. When state is the main actor, I think this is the international relations part which kicks in. State as main actor, so it's traditional. But more than that, threats which increase the likelihood of confrontation between the naval forces of a state. So when you have when your act makes a confrontation between naval forces or between two states and law enforcement agencies, then that could be considered as a traditional threat. But what are the non-traditional threats? Or there are many. Most of those are already mentioned by the UN Secretary General's report. So some of those are piracy and armed robbery against ships, illegal unreported fishing, smuggling and trafficking of person by sea, illicit trafficking in arms and weapons of mass destruction, etc. And for the purpose of this session, I will only explain two of these non-traditional threats. That is piracy and also armed robbery, piracy and armed robbery against ships, and IUU fishing. So moving on to the traditional maritime security, assertive actions in defense of sovereignty claims over disputed offshore islands or in defense of disputed maritime boundaries. Because of the area is quite unique, a lot of choke points, and to draw maritime boundary, they call it maritime delimitations, is quite hard. For Indonesia alone, we have around 10 maritime boundaries with neighboring states. So it takes a while for us to finish this kind of agreement, because it's a matter of sovereignty, and of course this is once you agree it will apply forever. So, and once you have that line, then only you know where you can exercise your law enforcement and where you can actually exploit and or explore the living resources that lies within. Thus, it's not very easy. I will also discuss about the South China Sea dispute later on, where actually the main problems of sovereignty claims, dispute offshore islands, maritime boundaries lies. And then incidents at sea between the naval power or states, and they think that they believe that under UNCLOS they can conduct, let's say, surveys or military activities in the EEZ. Sometimes different definitions from different countries, understanding what the articles of UNCLOS is. Some understands that EEZ is allowed for military to do their activity for their trainings, while others think that it should be done in the high seas, not the EEZ. So this misunderstanding, miscommunication can also start as a starting point for conflict. And then, as mentioned before, number of unsettled territorial claims and maritime boundaries, particularly territorial sea, contiguous zone, EEZ, and continental shelf. So we will understand how a state claims over a territory. So it's called the territorial entitlement. Well, once you can own that island, or let's say rock, or another features of maritime features, you will have the maritime rights on top of that, which is called also the maritime zone. So it's a very complex when you have territorial sea adjacent to other countries, and then, or you might have EEZ in other countries, then how you can explore those, or maybe the continental shelf, you know, the seabed, how you want to delineate with your counterpart. Then yeah, it takes time, and also sometimes people understand it differently. So it may take 10 to 20 years just to finish like one segment of the boundary. So unless these boundaries are settled by agreement, difficulties and violations are bound to happen, and you know, managing the maritime resources and security would be a problem. So I will start with the first non-traditional maritime security, which is piracy. UNCLOS provision in Article 101 is very clear. An act will be considered as piracy if it checklists these 5 elements. First, there are 2 ships involved, and then there is an illegal act of violence, detention, depredation, and it has to be done for private ends, because if it's done for political ends, it will be a regime for terrorism. But if this is for private ends, then it's for piracy, and it should be conducted on the high seas. And then there are different discussion whether high seas also include EEZ or not. So it's a discussion for another time. But those are one of those legal discussion that's being discussed by experts, and also it has to be done by a private ship. And Article 100 of UNCLOS mentions that all states needs to cooperate to the fullest possible extent in the repression of piracy. So this is already being a principle of UNCLOS, that in terms of repression of piracy, all countries has to cooperate. And people sometimes misunderstand between piracy and armed robbery. This is a very common misunderstanding, but it's actually quite easy. Piracy is conducted in high seas, but some people also think that EEZ is a high sea, but that's a different discussion. But armed robbery is very clear; it is conducted in territorial sea, and some also says that it includes EEZ because high seas is outside economic exclusive zone. International Maritime Bureau, IMB, sorry, not IMO, categorizes illegal acts conducted in internal waters, archipelagic waters, and territorial seas. So it's territorial sea inward as armed robbery. So how does this problem is actually a concern in the area? Because as we mentioned before, that sea lanes in Southeast Asia is one of the busiest in the world, and huge number of ships traverse in this region, important route for world trade. So pirates and armed robbers are very interested on this, and existing overlapping maritime claims, maritime boundary devastations are needed, because overlapping maritime claims create problems on which law enforcement should do where and when, you know, because it's a problem. Because if you know the line and you know the boundary, then you know that you have to you can implement your law. But when you claim on something but other state also claims on the same, it's not only that you maybe enforce your law, but your neighbor can say that you are against the law because it's in our territory. These problems also discussed in this area. And several institutions produces report on piracy. We can see the IMO, IMB, and also RECAP have reports regarding this matter. So the first one, if you want to see, you can see this. Also, you can quote these references in your reports. So from IMB, you can see that they have reports annually, but also sometimes they have reports, I think, in every 3 months. So you can see the type of reports they do. So this is how they put it on the map. Where are the places? Is it attempted attack, or it is boarded, fire upon, hijack, or suspicious vessel? They put all these different points in different areas, and we can see that Southeast Asia is one of those areas where, you know, we have a lot of points. And then we can also see more to the region. So total attacks in Indian subcontinent and total attacks in East and Southeast Asia is 66 in this period. So you can see where it is done. And if you read the report, it's more detailed. Is it only boarded or actually armed robbery actually completed, and so on and so forth. So the reports are quite clear. And then you can also check from this document recap. They have the annual report as well. And yeah, you can see from 2007 to 2020, and you can see whether it's piracy is conducted or armed robbery is conducted. So you can see the percentage. Because piracy has to be conducted in high seas, and armed robbery is actually territorial sea and inward. So most of the activities are actually armed robbery. But in terms of legal definition is the same. The illegal act is the same, but only where it is conducted, only it makes the distinction between the two. And now we move forward to IUU fishing. I will touch on this matter quickly. So IUU fishing is actually a practice in which fishing vessel ignore fisheries regulation in the territorial sea or in the EEZ or in the high seas or in areas where within regional fisheries management organization, RFMO. So if a regional organization already regulates matters related to fisheries, so we have to follow. And then IUU fishing also refers to illegal acts, including fishing without permits, catching prohibited species, using the illegal fishing gear, and then catching more than the permitted quota, and also not reporting or underreporting the number of fish caught. So this is the general definition of what is IUU fishing, so you can get the general idea about it. And then why this is a problem, because it creates, it threatens food security in the world. And so if you want to go into details, what is illegal, what is unreported, and what is unregulated, we can see these definitions from IPOA document. So you can see that illegal is without the permission of a state, and it's against the law of that state. Unreported, that the fishing activity is not being reported or misreported, and also against the law of a state. Unregulated is that you are not a party to an organization, and then you do fishing activity which is against the conservation and management measures. So if you want to go on this into detail, you can reference the IPOA IUU. So that's the document where we get all these details. And then, so what is IUU fishing in Southeast Asia? So as you know, why this is a concern, because major fishing producing countries are, of course, there in Southeast Asia: Indonesia, Myanmar, Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand. And then fisheries sector makes significant contribution to the livelihood and also food security. And for many people in Southeast Asia, people make money from this. So it's a concern, of course, in terms of economic and also security concerns. And then IUU fishing in this region also links to other forms of crimes, such as piracy, human trafficking, and smuggling. So there is a terminology which is called as crimes in fisheries sector, but also there is a terminology, a legal terminology, which says related crimes to fisheries activities. So there is a crime in the fisheries sector, but also there are crimes which are related to the fisheries activity. So those terminologies are being developed by different countries, including Norway, which is exploring the possibility of having the terminology called the fisheries crime. And then, so again, this is a problem in Southeast Asia because there are a lot of unresolved boundary, and delimitations between these countries are required so that we can resolve this problem easier. And of course, UNCLOS 1982 have different articles regulating this matter. We can see that UNCLOS establishes principles that apply to EEZ and high seas, stressing importance of fair, efficient, and use and conservation of living resources. Also, conservative actions you can see from Article 62(4). And also, UNCLOS also emphasizes the obligation of state to cooperate in conservation of and also management of living resources. And if you want to reference the documents on IUU fishing, you can check also UN Fish Stock Agreement, International Plan of Action to Prevent, Deter, and Eliminate IUU fishing that I mentioned before, the IPOA IUU. Now we go to the hot issue, the South China Sea dispute, and of course the next speaker also will touch upon this, but I will focus mostly.
You have 10 minutes left, yeah? So
okay.
that, you know.
So basically, I will touch upon the legal aspect of this. So as we know that this is mainly between. Also, we have to know that there is a group of states called as claimant state, and another states which are called non-claimant. So basically, the claimant state, they are claiming over two main islands, that is Spratly and Paracel Islands. And then it also not involves the claiming state, those claiming territorial entitlements, which means that the small islands which lays in this area, they claim the ownership of the islands. But also there are people from outside the region, countries from outside the region, based on their national interest, they want to be involved there. And then as we know that South China Sea is believed to be rich in its natural resources. So many other states, like mentioned before, they conduct FONOPs just to make sure that by law, all states enjoy freedom of navigation, including in the South China Sea. And Indonesia also have the same view that we don't have any claim to the features, but we have maritime rights arising from the archipelagic island of Indonesia, but those are only bordering with Malaysia and Vietnam. So that's clear for Indonesian position. So to understand the conflict of South China Sea, I think we can see it from the anatomy of the conflict. There are three main different points if you want to see the different point of view. The first one is the territorial entitlements, which means countries claiming over territory. So those countries who are claiming over territory, they are called claimants, and they try to have their claim over the islands in Spratly and also in Paracels. The second one is maritime rights or delimitation. So after you know the owners of these islands, then only you can draw the maritime rights or delimitations, because you know whether this maritime feature is a rock, maritime feature is an island, or this maritime feature is a reef, then only you know whether they are entitled 12 nautical mile or they are entitled 200 nautical mile, and so on and so forth. So this is the legal consequences of after you know the features of this maritime feature in the area. And after that, the third one is regional stability. Of course, we can see that there is AUKUS now, there is FONOPS, there is a 9-dash line. So I think most of the ASEAN countries understands the distinction between these three. So, okay, you have the territorial entitlements, and also after that, if you know you are the owner, then you know how to draw the maritime zone. Then only there is the other problem is the regional stability, where other countries also have interest in this. But Chinese approach is try to mix the three. So you know the other not only Southeast Asian countries but also other countries sometimes get confused whether this is actually the maritime boundary problem or actually the maritime entitlement problems, and also then they try to put together, oh, this is regional stability, US coming inside doing a FONOP, which is actually based on US's explanation. This is based on UNCLOS. So when you mix the three of the problem, then you get confused. But actually, in legal terms, it's very easy to see it. There is someone claiming over the territory, and after you know who is the owner, you can draw the line. And after that, of course, regional stability is based on people having interest, just applying UNCLOS in the area. So I won't go through again because of the time limit, but at least just to show to tell you that territorial entitlements is actually international law discussions, because you know how you can settle the ownership of the islands. It could be done by bilateral, so two countries agree, okay, that's yours, that's mine. It was done, I think, between this is rare, but it was done between Sri Lanka and India before, I think, to settle an island, who belongs to whom. But usually this is sent to the third party, so the court, and then they will explain. They have their jurisdiction over it, and they will tell which island belongs to whom. And then, so this is, if you want to see in South China Sea, there are different claims, and these dots are to show that these are claimed by these different countries. So that's how they claim over the ownership. So now maritime rights and delimitation, this is merely based on UNCLOS. So once you know the owners, UNCLOS gives provision on how to draw the lines. But now the problem is different countries claiming different areas which belongs to them, and they do the so-called unilateral claims of states. So each country have their own unilateral claims, but this is still okay as long as they are based on UNCLOS. But now we are faced with a problem. There is a country which have a claim called the 9-dash line based on historical rights. Now, how can you claim on something that you are not, you don't have a legal basis to it, international legal basis? And like China, they are also party to UNCLOS, then they know how to draw based on UNCLOS provision. So this is also international law discussion and could be explored further. And this is how it looks after you know the owners, and now you know how to draw it based on UNCLOS. This is how it looks. It's very messy. And then regional stability, of course, in the area we have declaration of conduct, code of conduct. This is what we develop to make sure that there is a good relation between one another, treaty of amity and cooperation, and then also this is an international relations negotiations. So I think I will touch upon this maybe later on question and answer. This is also very important and very interesting. And then I will touch a little bit on this one, Arbitral Tribunal 2016. So Arbitral Tribunal is actually Philippines bringing China to the PCA, to the Arbitral Tribunal, to ask several questions regarding the claims in South China Sea. So the award of this tribunal is very clear now, and then it makes life easier for many ASEAN states. One, that 9-dash line is not in line with UNCLOS, so it's illegal. And then none of the feature in South China Sea is entitled 200 nautical miles, which means that none of the features in the South China Sea is considered as island. Only rocks or reefs and so on and so forth, they have only 12 nautical miles maximum. So overlapping is not as complex as we thought. And of course, arbitration is not meant to resolve the territorial entitlement. They just try to explain the question being asked by Philippines to them. So this is what they have. But unfortunately, China, on the other hand, they think the arbitration award is null and void. So they think that it's not applicable. But in accordance with UNCLOS, it is applicable, and this is a source of international law. So if we see before the award, you can see that the complexity of the maritime zones. But now after the award, it's very clear. It's only 200. It's only 12 nautical miles, no 200 nautical miles. So it's very easy also for those claiming the different features in the area. It won't be very mixed up as we thought before. I think I will touch this maybe later on. Let's move on to the ASEAN, very shortly. So as we know that ASEAN is an organization in the region founded in 1967, and the main aim is to have to promote regional peace and stability, justice and rule of law, adherence to the principle of United Nations. And of course, in terms of maritime security, there are different laws that's already there in place. There are soft laws and also hard laws. Soft laws, you can see ASEAN Political Security Community Blueprint, one of those soft laws. But also we also have hard laws such as ASEAN Convention Against Trafficking in Persons. So these are the references that we can look at on different levels, soft law and also hard law. And then what are the frameworks in ASEAN regarding maritime security? The first one is the AMF, ASEAN Maritime Forum, founded in 2010. This is used as a forum for dialogue, promoting and also developing common understanding, confidence-building measures, and also preventive diplomacy. And the main aim is to address maritime concerns such as human trafficking, smuggling of migrants, IU fishing, illegal logging, maritime environment, piracy, and armed robbery. Another framework is the ARF. This is more external, outward. So this is in 1993, and also there are, I think, 17 partnering countries. So in total is 27. So the objective is simple: to foster constructive dialogue, political and security issues, confidence building, and also preventive diplomacy. And there are different statements being raised during these meetings. And also there is also like IRF international intersessional meeting on maritime security, and so on and so forth. So to conclude, I think the first thing that we can mention is that there are a lot of efforts that being made and also in place to address the threats of maritime security. And so we just need to use these efforts and develop forward. Maybe we can have more concrete steps in terms of more hard laws so that it could be binding and applicable. And then as we can see that ASEAN's maritime security cooperation mainly is on operational terms. So it's more information sharing, confidence building, and also capacity building. So what we need to do is to move forward and strengthen the legal frameworks. Those countries that haven't ratified some of the conventions need to do so. And also they need to have the implementing legislation at the national level so that it could be applicable. And then the prospect of promoting maritime security in Southeast Asia is based on common converging interests, of course, defending stability and also national unity. And moving forward, also ASEAN needs to retain its central role because it needs to be the heart of as a problem solving in the area. And we need to also ensure that maritime security do not get jeopardized with sensitive issues such as South China Sea, as mentioned before. And we need to also focus again on confidence, capability building, information sharing, and also exchange of practices. I think those are those are the things that I can share today. I think maybe we will develop more, especially on South China Sea issues in discussion. I know Dr. Tan after me also will also share his views on that, and I think we will have a very fruitful discussion today. I give back the floor to you, moderator Dr. Asyura. Thank you.
Thank you, Dudi. Thanks so much for that really comprehensive presentation. I particularly liked how you began with defining maritime security and then really discovering that there really is no definition of maritime security, which I think adds a lot to our confusion in trying to really come to terms in managing and addressing this field. But I think what really helped was you didn't just look at the definition or the lack of, rather you looked into the different contexts of how maritime security has evolved in terms of its usage. This is in the ICP and the UNSG statement. I think it's also important that you created a sharp distinction in the legal definition of piracy and armed robbery. How armed robbery does not take place in high seas, but piracy does. I think that's something that is definitely food for thought as we move forward. Also, particularly how I heard apparently some measuring centers like YCAPS are finding it, there's a lot of confusion in the methodology used between YCAPS or IFC or IMB, really trying to count the incidents of what is considered as piracy, what is considered as armed robbery. So your thoughts on that would be really cool. But you also looked into how illegal fishing should be defined legally: illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. The three different categories actually do refer to different types of activities, so it's really important to highlight this. But I think the most important or interesting bit of your presentation was when you highlighted the three different the tripartite elements rather in the South China Sea resolution: territorial rights, maritime rights, and regional stability. And really, if everybody just abided by UNCLOS, this would be an easy fix. Because UNCLOS does really set out clear legal terms. But then yet again, you threw a spanner in the works, but saying that's what UNCLOS tried to do with the arbitral tribunal in 2016. And we could have had a much more clearly delimited South China Sea, but I guess that wasn't adopted. So maybe perhaps either after this or in the question and answer session, we could look into what were the obstacles behind the arbitral tribunal. But yeah, then you ended with ASEAN as perhaps the solution to all this, right? If we really uphold ASEAN and its central role, particularly its ongoing processes like the ASEAN Maritime Forum and the ASEAN Regional Forum, perhaps we can really enhance our capacity building, our information sharing, and even confidence building. Last but not least, I think my main takeaway is that we need to strengthen our legal framework, our interpretation, and also our implementation of the international law that really dominates and runs the way we should operate at sea. So thank you very much for that, Dr. Dudi. That was really, really helpful. We are tight on time, but I would strongly recommend our participants to please keep the questions coming in the chat box, because we do have time at the end to bring all our 3 speakers in, and then we can have a question and answer session. And I think this would be a lot more interesting, because then we can have a engaging conversation across all 3. But without further ado, let's now move on to our last session, which will be Vietnam's position in the South China Sea. So very, very glad to be able to welcome Dr. Do Thanh Hai, who currently serves as Minister Counselor and Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of Vietnam in India, and is also a non-resident fellow at the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. He was previously a Senior Fellow and Assistant Director General at the EC Institute at the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. He obtained his doctorate from the Australian National University and his master's degree from Erasmus Mundus Global Studies Program. He has published on the Pacific Review, the Journal of Contemporary East Asia Studies, East Asia Policy, the ASEAN Forum, CSIS PACNAT, the Journal of International Review, DAV, and many other news outlets. He's the author of the book as well, titled Vietnam and the South China Sea, Politics, Security, and Legality, which was published by Routledge in 2017. And his latest books were both co-edited with Professor Leszek Buzinski. And this would be the South China Sea from Regional Maritime Dispute to Geo-strategic Competition. This was published in 2019 by Routledge, and also Maritime Issues and Regional Order in Indo-Pacific, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2021. That's this year. So congratulations on the release of the co-authored book. So without further ado, please, Dr. Do, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Asyura Salleh, and for very kind and generous introductions. And also thank the Kiniacademy to inviting me to have discussions with the class. That I'm very pleased to. Although I'm currently not an academic or maybe a scholar in track 2, but I'm really enjoying, the pleasure and the chance to talk about the topic I have done so much research on. So before the beginning, I would like to have a kind request that the session is mostly the information sharing for the education purposes. So it's mostly reflect my own views. It's not my government. So if you want to quote me, so please seek my consent on that. Anything that, because I may say something stupid. And I would like to start with, I would like to thank the 3 previous speakers who lay setting the scene and laid the background for my topic to work on with the specific case of Vietnam and how Vietnam to deal with the security, maritime security in the South China Sea. And I would like also to turn on, what is that? I have a slide, and I want to check whether you see it or not. Is that working on?
Yes, we can see it. Nice and clear.
Good, that's good. I have my full slide and I already sent to the organizers of the class, and I'm very happy to share across the class. And if you have any questions, just let me know. And before, I want to put something in perspective, because why the South China Sea and Vietnam have been spotlighted in the national media. I have to emphasize that before 2009, the South China Sea in Vietnam is not a topical issue, to be frank. So basically, there was the coverage of the South China Sea disputes, or occasionally, there sometimes the tensions fan up and it's go down, but it's not have the lasting effects at the moment. But of course, before 2009, mostly we don't see much the incident in the South China Sea. But since 2009, more and more incidents. That's the first thing. But the people interested more about China. So for the most 2000s, the basic questions about China is whether China rise peacefully or violently. And basically, the key argument is that China is rising or maybe developed in a peaceful manner. But I think that 2009, there are also the two very important developments. The first one is that Vietnam and Malaysia jointly submitted the report on the boundary of the extended continental shelves on the UN Commissions on the limits of the continental shelf that provoked China to publish the 9-line map. And the second one also very important, that Vietnam, after a long time after the war, become spotlighted again, because Vietnam is published that Vietnam seek a deal about 6 kilo submarines that amounting to about $2 billion US with Russia. So the question to the public is that why that small and impoverished country striking for development spend so much money on that type of submarines. That are very important. 2010, we also have another actor jump into space. We have the US Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton in Hanoi, and saying that, that the US have the national interest in the South China Sea. Of course, if you see when the USA, where the international media, and definitely Jiang Jiechi at that time at the front ministers of China's in the middle of the conference room with the ASEAN Regional Forum, stare at Geo, the Singaporean foreign minister, and say that China is a big country, other country are small, and it just fight. Was he respond when other countries raise the South China Sea issue, was in front of the US, also other big powers, and China don't like it, doesn't like it. And of course, subsequent decade, we see that the constant increasing tension in the South China Sea, and people care about, what the ASEAN did in the bunch of small fish, how they can counter the big fish, and whether they can force a consensus or not. And was it very lot of story about that. And it comes up to, because people talk about, as also mentioned, Dr. Doody talk about, people question now the law, whether the changing order, the trend, the people talking about, the rules-based order, freedom navigation, all the rules that happen. Of course, I'm talking about, the plight of the fishermen in the rivalry, in the disputes, so that they are depriving of some basic, things. And of course, come up with the great power rivalry, and now with the nuclear power submarines, that the AUKUS agreement that Andy already mentioned. So I think that basically I just put things in the context you would understand. But of course, for Vietnam, it's very interesting case that the people care about, how Vietnam responds to China rise, how Vietnam stood up, again, what is the coercive measure, the assertive. We see the pictures, the story of David, versus Goliath. And we see how Vietnam worked with the ASEAN country, whether the ASEAN is united or divided, what's wrong with the Vietnam play over there. And of course, that a lot of coverage about whether Vietnam warmed up relations with other powers to balance the China powers, and how the policy option for Vietnam with the China rise between the rock and hard place, and politics, a small power strategy is a way the struggle for power. Of course, definitely, if you one of the book, if important about the South China Sea is Robert Kaplan about the boiling cauldron, because he said that the fate of the South China Sea hanged up on Vietnam. Of course, we look in history, Vietnam, one of the country has stood up against China many times. And of course, we have a lot of coverage about, the dispute of fishermen and fishing community. And that basically, we have a lot of narratives and stories about the South China Sea. Usually the media interested in sex shop or maybe scenes or whatever. But now, with the tension rising up in the South China Sea, it considers at the phone lines of the new order that will draw a lot of attention from media, also the scholars as well. So basically, why Vietnam and so South China had been very topical issue for research and also international media. And basically, back to, of course, no, I will not cover all the things I mentioned in my slides, and feel free to ask questions and you want, but I will go through very quickly and how the South China Sea perceived international Vietnam national security, what are claims and the dispute, what Vietnam misperceived, what are the key challenges and how Vietnam respond to the challenges. I will focus on what is the distinctive features about Vietnam as compared to other claimants in other countries. So I think that it's important to make a case about Vietnam in that how the case of Vietnam has been, have drawn a lot of attention from international media, because it's a key players in that things, and it's a small player but important role, but it signifies also trend of the alignment or realignment in the regional politics. So that's the reason why we have the story to cover. And of course, I bet that you also will do a lot of things about it, and then how to think about to frame your story into different type of frames that already exist. Now, basically, how has Vietnam viewed the East Sea? Of course, in Vietnam, the Vietnamese people call it the East Sea, and of course, the Philippines call the West Philippine Sea, and of course, China called the South Sea, but of course, internationally referred as the South China Sea, and so international name, but also disputes, controversies among the claimants, also the party involved. But compared to Vietnam, it definitely, if you look into the history, the Vietnam believes, but the parasounds partly as a part of the national patrimony, because they have the evidence to prove the dynastic empires have to connect to these two islands group, from at least the 17th century. They also have to send the people regularly, and also the French into China. Of course, when Vietnam is colonized by France, they also raised a claim and also took the claim and also occupied this. And of course, they argue that the Chinese only came very, very late in 1909. So they don't even have the distinction between the parasol and Spratlys. And of course, they also argue that the China unlawful use of force in 1974 and 1988 is illegal. So that did not bring the Chinese the legitimate title over the things. Of course, there's also argument about the involvement of the Philippines and Malaysia is quite late. I mean, mostly in the 1970s and 1980s. So basically, what the Vietnamese perceived over, the sea and also the territories over there. But I think that is more important for Vietnam to gradually see the sea and islands at the security buffer and the link. Because if you look into the geopolitics of Vietnam, you see that it's really, the country, the S-shaped, elongated territory, quite vulnerable to the seaborne attacks. And most of the invasion in the modern history to Vietnam, mostly from the sea. That's the reason why the islands is considered as a critical outpost for the national security. And of course, the maritime zone is a part of the security for the country. And if you look into even the terrain, so the terrain of Vietnam is, you look into the middle of the Vietnam, so it's only 50 kilometers. I think it's very short and very vulnerable to the sea. And also it is separated by navigable waters. So in the past, Vietnam were invaded mostly through the sea and through the rivers. That's the reason why, Vietnam, they see that from the strategic point of view, they call that is lacks of strategic depth. It means that if you face an attack from the foreign invaders, you don't have much space you don't have much risk, to withdraw and also to fight. So that's the reason why that the French also, they have some logical idea, that when they occupy Vietnam, also they occupy Cambodia and Laos, because that will increase the strategic depth. But for Vietnam, so because of modern Vietnam is that so basically that gives the reasons that Vietnam consider the corridor, the sea corridor along the coastline is very important for security. So of course, it's a pool of resources. But I encourage you to look into that, but mostly the hydrocarbon and fish is very important for the national development. So I think that other speaker already mentioned that definitely is very important for Vietnam economies. Increasingly, Vietnam become a trading nations. That modern day now Vietnam trade is about 200% of GDP, is only behind Singapore, but Singapore is really small, so it doesn't count. So Vietnam is one of the the most open economy in the region, in the world. So that, the seaborne trade is very important for Vietnam, but for the regions as well. I have a footnote here is that still now we have a lot of air links and a lot of road links, but 90% of the trade in the world is remains seaborne. So that reason why that the sea and ocean are very important, the most important medium for the transportations, especially energy from the Middle East to East Asia. Also, I come up to how the busy sea lane, because you see the pictures of from Andy and also other people, so I don't mention this again. And fast forward, of course, there's a lot of that definition, perception. Of course, the media lie to the idea, how Vietnam be surrounded, how the living space and also the liberalism that is very constrained, by the expanding Chinese influence. Because it's whether or not Vietnam is landlocked, a sea-locked country, and of course it's very attractive to the medias and how to portray, Chinese expansion in the seas and also the influence in the regions and the way that to cover up. Of course, it has some logical because the China's and Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge collusion before to create a lot of problem for Vietnam, because from Vietnam to invade to what is that to interfere into Cambodia, and that definitely a lot of the debate on that. Of course, Vietnam argued that it's a legitimate worse because they have eliminated the genocide regime of Khmer Rouge, but of course other countries may have the different interpretations and of that. But that I had to bring the memory back, and now go back to the South, the claims and the disputes. But Dr. Dudi also mentioned that we have different type of claims. Of course, first one, but definitely with the sovereignty, but the Spratly and the paracels. And if you look into the paracels, we see the weaving, the fabric of occupation is very complex and mixed. And basically, of course, that already mentioned. So we have the sovereignty disputes of the paracel, the Spratly. Of course, the Scarborough Shoal, we have the dispute of the maritime boundaries and jurisdictions, of course, with different maritime entitlements, overlapping zone, and of course, the dispute over the legal status of the China U-shaped claim that many times that the China interpreted as a historic rise. We also have the different interpretations of UNCLOS, especially the legal features of the paracel and Spratly. The validity of the archipelagic baseline that the China apply around the paracel islands. Of course, we're also talking about the freedom of navigation and overflight that Dr. Dudi also mentions, that some country consider the other country military exercise in EEZ, other coastal states are illegal, but others would think differently. So the both think that the legal landscape seems to be very complex. in this. And of course, that encourage you to look into the UNCLOS. And of course, what you consider that the constitution of the ocean and the sea, I won't go there. But of course, the much controversies about the China claim, the 9-9 claim, which account for about 60 to 80% of the South China Sea, that many people believe that is goes against UNCLOS. Of course, I have the share map maybe with the Dr. Duty, but of course you see that how China mix up, the sovereignty dispute of the maritime claims. And so if you think that the China argument, if every features have the 200 nautical mile of EEZ and continental shelf, and we'll see a very complex pictures, legal landscape over that. But of course, after thanks to the tribunal ruling, so we see that it's very easy now. If you see the second pictures, you see that much of the claims to the features now should go back to about 12 nautical mile of the territorial seas, or maybe even the low tide elevation cannot have that territorial sea. So the disputed areas had been reduced to the minimum. Of course, if China complied to the tribunal ruling, also complied to the UNCLOS, so we have. Well, I think the South China's dispute are not a big issue at the moment. But of course, China still have very, very weird interpretations of UNCLOS and also the historic rights that lead to the most of the conflicts and the problems we have today. The problem for Vietnam that, isn't have the legitimate claims, whether they have the power to defend that. Of course, the same thing apply maybe to other countries, if you have the claim, but do you have insufficient power to stand up and to counter the assertive actions and claims by other claimants? So that leads to very complex situation there. So Vietnam foreign policies, I have also put the South China Sea. Of course, normally no country wants to have a bad relation with China, with the big power, and so with United States, anything. The small and medium-sized country, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and of course, the Singapore, Cambodia, they don't want to mess up with the big powers. What they want to peace, stability, and productive relationship, working relationship with neighbors and big power. But of course, they also want to stand to defend their sovereignty and legitimate interests. Because sometimes, these two goals are going together, but most of the time they did not go together. So because if you don't have enough sufficient power to defend your sovereignty, because you may have some type of, unequal type of relationship, or maybe you have to compromise some other interests. But for Vietnam, one of the ways that Vietnam stand quite stand down among the peers, among the Southeast Asian country, because they quite skillfully to manage to secure the dual foreign policy goals for a sufficient time. Because the Vietnamese approach is still maintain the sovereignty of the Paracel and Spratly, even though the Paracel is already fully occupied by the Chinese. Because they go for the respect for UNCLOS, and of course go on the maritime claims to be aligned with UNCLOS text and spirits. Because they advocate for no threat or use of force or peaceful means under the UN Charter and UNCLOS, at the right mechanisms to different type dispute, and also to comply with other instruments like contract use and DOC. Was usually that the common lines occurs that more or less the same with the Southeast Asian claimant, except the claim over the Paracel and Spratly. But Vietnam, like other countries, also sent a couple of non-verbal United Nations to circulate their positions. And I think I would like to draw your attention to that non-verbal battle in United Nations that that involve dozens of countries, even involve the external powers like US, Australia, Japan, 3 European countries that also speak out, stand up, and speak out against the Chinese unlawful claim in the sea. So of course, also Vietnam rely on ASEAN also medium to work with China. So of course, working the most important at the moment is to build up the code of conduct, because there are a lot of controversies and of course a lot of debates on the process. But of course, many external powers don't want China's and ASEAN country to sit in a closed room and to set the rules for the region, and they want the set of rule. Any come down from the type of gathering have to respect and also comply with national law, and also with no prejudice to the rights and obligation of third countries. I go down, of course, we see that Vietnam raised the issue with many countries because they think that the peace stability in the South China Sea is an international issue. It's not only for coastal state. And that's the reason why that they call for the applications of UNCLOS and the effort of the country to maintain peace and stability in the region. Key challenge, of course, basically, I'll go very fast. If you have, how much time did I still have? I need to check.
Just on time. You've got 10 minutes remaining, so feel free if you want to.
More. Okay, so because now I'm being little bit academic at the moment, to provide some analytical frameworks, because sometimes I forget myself at academic before, but we need to distinguish between threats and risks. If you call one country, call other country a threat, it means that that would be the possibility of war happen to them soon. So you need to make own the preparation for that. If it's just a risk, for so that what you deal with is mostly the risk management. So threat is combinations of the capability and the intent. If you have one country that have capability and also that also have the intention to invade you, so that is a problem. So that makes this country immediately a threat to other. And to cope with threat, one country have the only two actions from the realist point of view. Either you balance against that or you bandwagon with that. So basically, come back some theory of the national relation for you. But the risk is combination of possibility, probability, and consequences. It means that it may happen, it may not happen, right? So you see that the risk of war. So it means that the war can happen and the war may not happen. Of course, the consequences could be low or maybe be high, it depends. So basically, I would argue that in the post-Cold War, even China become more have a very expensive claim and also become very assertive. But Vietnam and other Southeast Asian countries don't consider China as threats. But it just consider them as a source of risks, because you also have multiple sources of risks about if you talk about non-territorial security, and also mentioned by Dr. Doody and also mentioned by Dr.Asyura Salleh at the beginning, because also the natural disasters, also the problem to the navigation, the piracies, the armed criminals, any type of violence that would have, the sea level rise. It's the natural, and also it's also have the human factors as well. So if you talk about risks, so there's no chance that you can remove the whole risk. A threat you can have it and limited by different ways, but risk is still over there. But of course, although if they face no threats, but it has a range of risks, especially in terms of traditional securities. The risk of armed conflicts in the South China Sea very low in the previous decade, but it have been rising very quickly in 2010 and the subsequent decades, because we see the more frequencies of the clashes and also standoff at sea. We see involvement with different things. But recently we see with the crowd of the submarines in the South China Sea, the U.S. submarines bang into something that is not the unidentified object at the moment. So of course, it means that the possibility of wars, of armed conflict is increasing over the last decade, because that brings us to the subsequently how Vietnam cope with the the riskier South China Sea or the riskier ground in the South China Sea that may have seen. Right, because if you look into the history, you see that maybe you have to be aware that the armed conflict is not been eliminated. That at least and 3 occasions that the China use resort to arms to use the upper hand in the South China Sea to jump to move in the some reefs, occupy some reefs from under the control of other state, because you will see that. But of course, it leads to the literatures, how we perceive the China's approach to the South China Sea. That's great that Andy had already so mentioned about the gray zone operations. But of course, also other scholars also talk about the South China Sea is comparable to Russia, to Ukraine, and also other part of with it near abroad. It's been the hybrid warfare. It's mean that defined as a broad, complex, adaptive, and highly integrated combination of conventional and unconventional means, overt and covert activities by military, paramilitary, irregular civilian actors that targeted to achieve geopolitical and strategic objectives. So I mean that is that different time frame also for how the China operate in the South China Sea, and of course that encourage also media look into how China activities and claim in the South China Sea. I think is a combination of different elements, but we see the coercive actor at sea, we see economic statecraft also apply, we see the diplomatic and political leveraging, and also through various kind of bilateral relation that at the expense of the ASEAN grouping. And of course, we also see the propaganda and so perception battle, we also the legal warfare. I go very well quickly so that you can, from the media point of view, you can under very brief overview of what the people talk and analyze about the Chinese activities and actions over there. So that the people try to map out what happened in the South China Sea from the period 2009 until 2016. And you see that the increased number of frequencies about the clashes and standoff, and also how different type of incident happen, mostly involved with the Chinese elements, either the fishing, either the coast guard, either the Navy ship that happen across the South China Sea. Plus we see different type of the literatures about the China tactic, about the cabbage, or maybe the salami slicing, the cabbage tactic. It's just some terms that will give you, some ideas about how the formation of ship have been, deployed in the sea. You see the warship involved. You see the coast guard cutters. China, the biggest coast guard cutter in the world. It's about 12,000 tons. It docked at Munster. And of course, if you see other country coast guard come to that coast guard cutter, they see they very small and they don't have the scam. So we ask why the people invest so much money to build that big ship. And previously, China renovate, the warship into the coast guard to make, the warship into the civilian ship. That make, that ship in also that type of different type of monster at sea. We also see the deployment of maritime militia, other type of economic activity like oil and survey vessels. And of course, over the last years, you see the Chinese survey vessels everywhere in the South China Sea, in Vietnamese economic zone, in the Malaysian, Indonesia, in Philippines, and also beyond the regions as well. And so the question is whether that type of activities illegal or lawful or unlawful, of course, how can you counter and also how to block it? Of course, because behind that survey vessel, so you also see maritime militia because that's cutter. What will you do? Behind the different type of formation that will give other countries very different choices. Now, of course, if you see, if you're interested in the strategic standpoint, when you see how many vessels China have, how many combatants, comparisons that China now become the biggest navy in the world, and it's bigger and all the Asian state combined, right? So how can you work with that? And if you see the Coast Guard, even, the Coast Guard China's have also dominated the sea. So it's just the number that could say you something, how, if you put yourselves in the, in Kuala Lumpur, yourselves in, the government of Vietnam, Philippines and Brunei and Singapore and Indonesia. So what can we do? I'm quite still surprised that Indonesia still consider they are not non-claimant to the South China Sea disputes. That's one way or another, but we see increasingly the Chinese survey vessels and fishing present near the Natuna Islands, and that creates a lot of tension between the two countries. So become very quick. Of course, the China built up the very large scale artificial island in the middle of the sea. And if you think that is useless, so think again, because that kind of facilities give the China's more frequent at sea, and they can deploy the vessels permanently near Malaysia, near Vietnam, in the area of Vietnam, near the Philippines, because you see 24/7 the Chinese have vessels near the Luconia shore. That is just dozens of nautical miles from the Malaysian coast. So what is it? What does it mean? That the permanent presence over there. This means that how can you trace away and claim? So that a big issue to many countries. And of course, it's very interesting to see how Vietnam as a country respond to that. And of course, you see, interested to you from the strategic point of view, you see the range of the missile that would be deployed in those islands, to see, how things that have been changed, the strategic landscapes have been different, from when China built up that type of basis in the middle of the sea. So of course, if you follow the ASEAN, you have a lot of debate about ASEAN, whether ASEAN is success or a failure, whether ASEAN unite or ASEAN become a disarray under the Chinese pressure. We see how the China maneuvering between the different type of bilaterals to get the leverage, the press for joint development, the COC, the DOC, and also the different type of engagement with the major powers. We see, of course, economic instrument. We see how the China boycott, the bonanza from the Philippines to stop the tourists, the flow of tourists to other countries. And could you see incentive from the Belt and Road Initiative? Because Philippines is another country that are quite disappointed, with the Chinese promise of the investment in the country under that scheme. Because not only the Philippines, but other countries, big Chinese project in Indonesia and Malaysia as well. So very interesting that is not the only front, but you see that the propaganda, the information, the publicity become a front that you may or may not know. What the Chinese have the idea of three warfares. It's mean the public opinion, psychological warfare, and the legal warfare as well. And if you follow the South China Sea, it's very interesting, how different type of source information that will provide you. For example, so I don't talk about the perception. You can study itself, but of course it's good for the media to understand. But you are also part of the battle. You are also part of the information and legal warfare, and also psychological warfare. And of course, you talk about what is that? The Thucydides chap, how to influence the Chinese nationalism, the netizen, 100 years of humiliations. It's all type of very, very interesting, narratives that will be shaped throughout the way. We'll talk about the way a cycle of action reactions, and so China claim, and then the legal warfare, how historical anecdotes have been told, how the legal and counter arguments, and of course you see that a lot of books have published and that could provide media a lot of people, and of course I've become very famous because my topic and publish a book about that to become of the debate, because you see the whole range of the publication to that. So no worries, you have a lot of literature and scholarship to do, to study if you want to do. But of course, China's become very smart, and they publish, they perhaps hired the scholar to publish a book in 1980s when nobody knows about the South China Sea, to talk about the historical evidence anecdotes. But of course, the people see that the China have a bank of all the things that the scholar can go on to go. that event very interesting. Was, you know, you see the SCSPI on the left, on the right, above right side. That also the initiative deployed by the University of Beijing to talk about, you know, different activities. And I'm political scientist, and one time that I become very familiar with, you know, all type of ship tracking, the marine traffic, and also what type of vessel fighters. Just because you want to find what is the issue, what is ship over there, how to do it, and, you know, whole type of, you know, the propaganda warfare and stuff. You know, one day that the Chinese scholar came down with the idea that, you know, the hundred of Vietnamese fishing intruded into waters of Hainan. I was so surprised. I said that really Vietnam fishermen, we have the bravery that, you know, they don't afraid, you know, how the Chinese, you know, I mean, perimeter defense that important. They also it's also the rumors that the Vietnam fishermen, you know, approach very clear to the submarine base in Sanya. Said that what? So what is the defensive measure you have in case, you know, even the fishing ship can penetrate that deeper? Because you see there are so many misinformation and many things that happen that will create, you know, the whole network of information, the cloud information about the South China Sea definitely is very rich. And of course, if you have the tribunal ruling, China scholar also published about 534 pages about how critical study of the tribunal awards. You know, which are the critical point by point by the tribunal ruling, and it's interesting that comes up different things and that the legal warfare I mentioned. And of course, you know, the network of the China, pro-China's newspaper, and also the network of the Chinese media across the world increasingly. And interesting for me at our discovery is that, you know, China put the 9-line map in all the scientific journals. So whenever, I mean, in the in the physics, in the geometry, in the naturals, in the, I mean, hard science, you see the China map with the 9-line. And of course, you know, I got, I think, 10,000 of them everywhere. And how that to shape, you know, the map, you know, the, what is that, the mental map, you know, of China. Of course, it comes to the movie, it comes to the Red Sea operation, it comes to what is a small kid, you know. So you think that it's spilled into the cinemas as well. And of course, you know, that is an idea. So how Vietnam cope with that is also really the most interesting that the media think whether Vietnam is accommodated to China or whether Vietnam stood up to China, whether Vietnam make a choice, you know, to allies with US and other powers to cope with, I mean, to China, or whether Vietnam and China as a two communist country, they work together. So that's the reason why that Vietnam is a very interesting story to media, and I hope that you can have a chance to look into the case. But the Vietnam behavior in the South China is also complex. But see, what I call the multi-pronged hatching. So if you see that different contradicting, you know, elements within the policy, we have on the one hand, Vietnam engaged very deeply with other claimants, including China, to negotiate, you know, the settlement of the dispute, to negotiate the COC, to negotiate the DOC. It also involved in, you know, hard balancings with regarding to, you know, invest heavily to modernize its submarines and also on type of defensive measures. It also one of the country take a lead, you know, in building up the law enforcement, one of the sturdiest law enforcement unit, you know, within Southeast Asia, and also it engaged with other countries, especially major power, try to, you know, create, you know, a network of partnership. It have about 30 agreement of partnership with all the major power. So many people think that Vietnam is also one way another try to realign with other major power to work on that. Because there are many, it's quite controversies and many arguments from the scholarly point of view. Of course, but I think that Vietnam is pursued a very independent foreign policy in the way that, you know, it will try to avoid any side up with one country against another's, and it tries to separate things and and worked out in a very mature manner in a way to settle the dispute for the long-term interest, but also at the same time behave quite responsibly to any crisis that happen. Because Vietnam can do many things, but it was so far I think that the Vietnam policy into that is quite sophisticated and complex. Because it worked out gradually clarifying the claims and aligned it with the UNCLOS. And it's a long-standing settlement. We will see that Vietnam has been the leader in settling the dispute with the neighbors. It had the first country have the maritime boundary with the China's in the Gulf of Tonkin, and currently negotiating with China's at the area of the Gulf of Tonkin. Simultaneously, also talk with Indonesia, Philippines, and Malaysia on delimiting different conflict for the overlapping areas. It also engaged in a lot of dispute management and conflict including measures with regular talks, with hotlines, and of course to discuss the DOC, COC, also the code, the code for the unplanned encounter at seas. And of course, it also cooperate in
wrap up really quickly.
Yep, I will wrap up it in 1 minute.
Sure, amazing.
Yes. So of course you see that it's a whole cooperative measures that already been put into place. It's the workshop conference, the joint scientific survey with Philippines, the joint survey with Philippines and China between 2005 to 2008, joint patrol with China in the Gulf of Tonkin, and of course porthole joint activities. And of course you build up quite quickly the maritime capabilities and building. And of course it have also major the network of the partnership with all the majors across the globe, and of course engage a lot of proper crisis management. And of course, when the crisis happen, I have seen that Vietnam behave persistent but very patient. It stand very firm on the ground, but at the same time, it's not overreact to the Chinese activity. It keep open the communications. It open up and speak very vocally, and of course it tried to manage the national sentiment so that the work is not stand out. So briefly, 4 points about Vietnam. That the issue of the South China Sea is very important national security problem for Vietnam in the post-Cold War. Vietnam see UNCLOS and the status quo as part of the rule-based order as a critical interest. Of course, the risks of the traditional security of the conflicts are long-term, comprehensive, and increasingly complex. And Vietnam response to that is central upon multi-pronged risk management that will help the country defend its own interests at the same time to maintain the working relationship with all neighbors. So thank you very much, and hope that I could clear some questions and things about the Vietnam as a case study about this maritime security in the South China Sea, also beyond. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tan. I think that was really helpful. I've not really encountered a presentation that really gave me a holistic perspective of all the driving elements shaping not only Vietnam's stance, but also the South China Sea dispute. I think just to really review on, to really provide a summary of Dr. Tan's presentation, you really began with looking at this strategic lens that Vietnam used to view its position vis-a-vis South China Sea, or what Vietnam calls the EC. And then you made this really interesting statement before you went to your next section, where you really, posed two different elements against one another, where you posed power versus legitimate claim. So to what extent does Vietnam really have the power to want to enforce its claim in the South China Sea? And at the end of the day, what really matters? Is it first to follow the rules-based order and to uphold legitimate claims as stated in UNCLOS? Or this really, as you had the comparison of the different military capabilities, and clearly China took up nearly half of that slide, or does power really dictate the conversation more? You then really looked into shaping Vietnam's foreign policy stance and its strategy, which also includes this battle over the note verbal, which took place in 2020, and Vietnam reaching out to India to also craft a joint statement that upholds UNCLOS. Really interesting that Vietnam has done this to not only participate in this release of diplomatic notes, asserting the spirit of UNCLOS, but to also then reach out to another extra regional power like India, and then say, hey, India, join me in also upholding UNCLOS. And then you provided the journalists with a very interesting analytical framework that we could move forward with. What elements fall under threat and what elements fall under risks. So then how can we define and create a clear distinction between what we should see as a threat or what we should define as a risk? I think this is very important as journalists try to really provide an estimate of the type of threats or the risks that a particular country would face in the future. But I found your expansionist strategies that China has employed particularly interesting, especially on the different, the perception battles and the ideology that goes on behind it, the extent to which China is just pushing out thought and really shaping the literature that we're seeing out there. China hadn't accepted or consented to the arbitral tribunal verdict in 2016, but it did have the time to craft a 500-page journal paper in justifying why. So that was really quite interesting. You also mentioned the economic statecraft. I think one of our participants asked about BRI. That's something we could allude to. The different types of coercive strategies, salami slicing, cabbage tactic, and even the development of facilities on islands, which allows China to project its power closer to the shores of the claimant states and therefore be able to maintain a permanent presence, being very close to the other shores of Malaysia, Brunei, Philippines, and even Vietnam. Last but not least, what you then did was really reiterate that Vietnam's South China Sea policy, which included claimant management, cooperation, hard balancing strategies, and also multidimensional balancing. But what I think Vietnam has done very well is its crisis management, the way it has attempted and has I think, relatively successfully stood firm against China's assertive behavior at sea, but with a lot of patience as well. And somehow Vietnam always emerges scot-free. So that's something that the rest of the region really has to learn from. So thank you very much again, Dr. Thanh. I thought that was very, very enlightening indeed. We will now move on to the forum and question answer side of things, where I hope to hear from the participants what they thought about the 3 or 4 talks that we had this afternoon. Did it really help you in better framing your understanding of maritime security? And also there was a lot of emphasis on the geopolitical side of things. And as Andy mentioned earlier, he hoped that he has convinced you that really, in addition to non-traditional and ecological threats, the geopolitical and geostrategic side of things are as important as well. It'd be really interesting to hear how you felt about that. I will open the floor to any questions. And in the meantime, please feel free to leave your questions and your thoughts in the chat box, and we can definitely get the conversation going. Okay, so we have a question here submitted via Google form. Oh, that's nice. So the world is facing a sea pollution problem, and Indonesia is one of the largest plastic waste contributor in the world after China. If not taken seriously, marine pollution will impact not only on marine ecosystem and human health, but also tourism sector and the economy. So what have countries in ASEAN done to tackle the problem? And has this issue received enough attention from ASEAN countries? Perhaps we can move on to, maybe we can hear from Dr. Doody on this, on what ASEAN's role has been. Dr. Thanh and Andy, if you'd like to share your 2 cents, you can as well. In the meantime, Dr. Thanh, if you're able to stop your screen sharing, would that be possible? That way we can kind of see everyone who's in the room. Thank you so much. Dr. Doody, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Asyura. And the question is very timely indeed, because I think plastic pollution or marine pollution is very concerning. And as the question mentioned, that it's making new problems in the ecosystem of the oceans. But in ASEAN, I think we can see it from 2 perspectives. If you want to see what ASEAN have done, I think the first one we can see that ASEAN, I think in 2019, launched the so-called ASEAN Regional Action Plan for Combating Marine Debris in ASEAN member states. So there is a regional plan of action which was made by the ASEAN states. I think during that time it was the Thailand who was the chair, and then initiated this program, and there's a plan of action. You can see that there are different steps that are being taken, the principles that wants to be upheld in the region regarding this. And secondly, more outward is we can see the East Asia Summit leader statement on combating marine plastic debris. I think there were several statements made on this one, I think in 2017, I think, and also on 2018. And then also there is also a plan to have a kind of plan of action in East Asia Summit level. But the only problem that East Asia Summit is not as comprehensive as ASEAN. ASEAN has different pillars. They have the political, and then they have the economic, and so on and so forth. But so to deal with this issue within ASEAN, I think it's more easier. And once we have this action plan, usually the countries tries to uphold the statements and also the aspirations by the different ASEAN member states. But in East Asia Summit is a different one, because East Asia Summit is not as compact, the organization. It's mostly is a meeting between either summit or also sometimes ministers level, but they do not have a working level kind of organization. But East Asia Summit have different kind of countries, of course, outside ASEAN, like Russia, also Korea, Japan, China, where we want them to also be involved in such measures. You know, like they the mention about China, also a huge contributor to this pollution. Also other countries who can be like a funding country, like Japan, also Korea, or maybe India in this case. So what we need to do is to combine the two. We don't want to have one plan of action in ASEAN and then the other one in East Asia Summit, but does not correlate to each other. Maybe the one in ASEAN can be done first, because we already have the plan of action, and also we have the working group to do so, to check the reports, what countries have done during these years. But also during the bigger East Asia Summit can learn from what we have in regional, and also try to find ways how to also apply with other countries such as China, Japan, and India. I think those are my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Doody. I think it's refreshing to see that ASEAN has already dedicated a working group to tackling marine debris. This was also reflected, as you said, in EAS. We've got plans of actions. We're holding states accountable, looking at annual reports. But how much of this is actually taking place on the ground? To what extent are countries really dedicating assets and planning their national strategies around marine pollution and plastic pollution, really upholding this as a key goal of ASEAN? I think I alluded earlier to agenda setting, and how policymakers really try contend with this complexity or competition in agendas and priorities. And is marine pollution really up there in terms of ASEAN, and even in terms of the priorities of our regional neighbors? This is a good question, because it also leads us to think, what more can we do to transform these working groups into more actionable outcome? Currently, from my perspective, I'm not seeing that, but it'd be really great to hear if you guys feel that you are seeing it as well.
Well, if I might add, I think in a similar fashion, marine plastic pollution dovetails with concerns about climate change, especially in Indonesia. All these island countries, archipelagic countries that are quite vulnerable to the rise of sea levels. And I do agree with you, Asyura, that there is some sort of competition brewing, or if not, it's already underway, between states' capacity to pay attention, to heed to these non-traditional concerns, to more traditional ones. And it's and as Dr. Hai Do has explained, the greater the risk of interstate frictions in the South China Sea will sadly and unfortunately distract national attention of these countries to focus on the less traditional security concerns.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. That was a sobering reality that you brought to us.
we have to keep track with the reality.
Yeah. Do you have any comments?
I think also I'm quite pessimistic on that. I mean, as I with Andy to other people. So when we have hierarchy of problems in the region, so I think that the government pay more attention to the traditional security.
Sorry, can you speak louder, Hai Do?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you speak louder? Yeah. Sorry. Yes. Okay.
So of course I have a more pessimistic on that, and because if we have a hierarchy of the problems in the South China Sea and elsewhere, so I think that the national security issue comes first, especially in the hard defense term. And of course, we see a lot of investment in the submarines and other things. It's not investment in tackling with the plastic and other things. And the second thing that we have the framework between ASEAN and EAS. But of course, as people mentioned, that how much action that we put on the ground. So I'm quite doubtful, because it is indeed into in the hand of the sovereign state. So I think it's very hard, because I think every country have the national program to reduce plastic. But do we really have some substitution for plastic? No. And I think the use of plastic already is also increased during the pandemic. So we go back to the food delivery, everything, and I see, the fight up every day in my house, everything is a plastic bag, and the plastic things. And because this will be more problematic in the future when we have all kind of mask, disposal mask, everything, all the disposal things we have.
Definitely.
Yeah. So I think that we need to tackle these are always the people to tackle the hard security.
Yeah. I don't understand how so these are important issues, but I don't understand how governments can actually because it's a matter of lifestyle as well. So how the governments of each country can mobilize its population, to stop using plastic. I think this problem is more of a bottom up than a top down. The solution lies in a bottom up, not a top down solution. I mean, ASEAN governments, ASEAN countries can meet and talk, but only the people, have their final say whether they're going to stop using plastics or not. Because it's just very hard how a top-down solution to this marine pollution can be tackled.
Yeah.
Just to react a little bit, Asyura.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just to react to Andy and also to Dr. Do regarding these ASEAN measures. I think it is correct that the action plan is mainly putting the standard setting first, more to the implementation or applicability. So if we see that the content of the action plan is more to policy support and planning, so that's one pillar. And then research, innovation, and capacity building, that's another pillar. Private sector engagement, and also public awareness and education outreach. So if we see from these different pillars, we can already see what is the aim of having this action plan. It's more to community learning, giving the information regarding this awareness building and so on and so forth. And maybe, hopefully, the next step, as Andy and also Dr. Do mentioned, that this could be implemented bottom up. But hopefully, Dr. Do won't be that pessimistic again in the coming years. we have to be optimistic because we should start from the action plan. Then only we'll have something more concrete on the ground. Thank you.
Definitely. I think ASEAN provides the standards. It's up to the country's political willingness. Okay, I'm sure everyone saw the kind reminder from Adib in the chat that we do need to look at the other questions, everyone. So I'm going to open the floor to Carmela von Buena. If you're there, do you want to elaborate a bit more on your questions? Carmela is asking on arms race.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Carmela of the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism. Thank you for organizing this masterclass. As I told Danny, obviously in the Philippines, there's a lot of opinions about maritime security, and there's also a lot of noise, but it's good to hear what other countries think also about the situation. So my question, which Dr. Tan has addressed in part, is what do the other speakers think about the Thucydides trap, the inevitability of armed conflict, the supposed inevitability of conflict between the US and China? But more importantly, my question is, how do we avoid that trap? Thank you.
Thanks for that. Andy, this is your question.
Okay. So if I get this right, Thucydides trap means I have a copy of a history of the Peloponnesian War, in which Graham Allison quoted that term, made that term. I think the trap means, a rising great power will make the existing great power insecure. So war is inevitable between them. I think when we reflect on the situation between China and United States, oftentimes we hear people say there is misunderstanding, there is miscommunication. I think we have to make it very clear. In order to solve a problem, you have to admit there is a problem. I think there is no misunderstanding as such. There is a full frontal confrontation and collision between the two. America will not let China retake Taiwan. America will not let China control the South China Sea in the way that China wishes to. Nor will China tolerate America to keep supporting Taiwan, supporting countries in the South China Sea that are in disagreements with China over claims in the South China Sea. So there is a full-on frontal collision. The question is, to what extent this collision does not degenerate into a full-scale war? And I think this is where the operational matters come into the picture. I think there should be a lot more, not just confidence-building measures, because that have been done for decades. And I think the regional countries, and especially ASEAN, should take a step up and try to ask the hard questions. How can we engage in less confidence, not less as in terms of less activities? Certainly CBMs are important, but they should broaden their scope into, say, crisis management mechanisms, dispute settlement mechanisms. How, I explained about the rising acquisitions of submarines, increasing acquisition of submarines. So there will be a lot of submarines in the water. And as Hai Do has mentioned, there is an increased risk of submarine collisions. So what can ASEAN countries do in order to minimize this? For instance, there should be a transparency, a water space management. Countries should declare their submarine primary area of operations, for instance. So a lot of crisis management mechanisms are available out there, hotlines between naval and coast guard chiefs between countries. Code for unplanned encounters at sea, how two law enforcement ships or Navy ships can avoid collisions during when they were performing their patrol duties. So these are the options that the countries should look at. And I think there is a greater chance to alleviate concerns of miscommunications at the operational level rather than at the strategic and political level. For the strategic and political levels, I'm sorry to say there is no misunderstanding. This is a full-on head-on collision of clash of interest between America and China. That said, I don't think war is inevitable. I think America and China still has interest, still has shared interest. Economics is the fundamental part, but as history suggests, two countries which are interdependent in economy did start a war. Germany and UK were interdependent economically in the early 20th century, but still they went to war. America was Japan's largest export market in the 1930s. They went to war. So economic interdependence in and of itself is not guaranteed that two countries cannot start a war.
Thanks, Andy. You know how they say, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. So let me that. You mentioned employing rules of engagement as a potential crisis management mechanism. You mentioned cues, for example, but I want to actually look at the legal aspect to this. Legally, Dr. Doody, do you think what kind of legal mechanisms can we resort to? Is there really a positive outcome in the current processes that ASEAN is participating in its really trying to help the region avoid this growing conflict between the US and China?
I think it is clear that this should be looked into through international relations angle, because I think from the three anatomy of conflict that I mentioned, this is more to the regional stability. And if we want to talk about the territorial entitlements or the maritime rights or maritime zone, it's quite clear. The law is there. The law mentioning how a state can be the owners of islands, reef, or rocks, or any other maritime features in the area is quite clear. And once you have the owners, then it's going to be very easy for you to determine how long, how far is the maritime zones that they have. But talking about the US and China rivalry, I think it's quite clear that US is against aggressive actions of China in the area. So that's why they do the FONOPs. And then China, on the other hand, thinks that this US US FONOPs or their presence creates instability. And thus, this is the hegemony. There's the two powers, and also, the best way to deal with this is international law. If the US is doing FONOPs based on UNCLOS, then they can do so, but they don't do also, like, at the same time, let's say, seismic survey or any kind of surveillance, which also is against international law. And on the other hand, China, if they think that they want to claim that area, then they need to know how far they can limit their activity there, creating military bases and so on and so forth. It's not part of the problem here. And we can see also from public narratives here, US tries to support ASEAN's claim against China, saying that we can sail, fly, operate wherever international law. So in this case, it looks that the US is actually giving a side to ASEAN. But on the other way, China thinks that the US and Australia is not neutral anymore. Why do they come in an area where they are far away from? And this a conflict between countries should be done between them, not with external power. So ASEAN, who is actually in the middle, think that, okay, we welcome anyone who supports UNCLOS, but we are against any power projection based on rivalries. So this is clear. ASEAN states are very fond of UNCLOS. We support UNCLOS fully, but once US or any other countries comes into picture and tries to, let's say, help us in terms of arguments, but this is because they want to have a power projection, based on rivalries here. So we have to say no to that. That's why Andy also mentioned about how AUKUS was, actually by Malaysia and Indonesia, we were not, liking this idea that much, even though we didn't mention AUKUS literally in the statement. So this is how we deal with the problem. We want to be friends with everyone, and also just making sure that the regional stability also maintained. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dudi. I think this is what you're saying. It really reflects what we've been highlighting so far, really maintaining this fine balance in crisis management. I think Carmela has something to add on Taiwan. Please go ahead.
I just wanted to, I think there's long been an agreement that obviously legal frameworks need to be in place, and that's the ideal way of resolving the conflicts. But there are also a lot of impatience, obviously, in the sense that these frameworks take too long, and sometimes the institutions, even the ASEAN institutions, they're not felt or they're not actionable. In the context of Taiwan, for example, we've seen what happened to Hong Kong. And I remember a security expert saying, let's watch what China does to Hong Kong. And we've seen what it did in Hong Kong. So given the current discourse on Taiwan now, we've seen Xi Jinping issue a statement on Taiwan again. What are the prospects given the current situation?
Thank you, Carmela. I'm going to push this to Dr. Tan, because we've not heard from him in the last round. Would you like to comment?
Yep. So, I think it's very important questions that we need to ask ourselves. Yes, whether the possibility of the conflict between the two major powers that already happened, in the World War I and World War II. But I think the logic is that if you want peace, so you have to prepare for wars. So I'm more the hardcore realist and anti a bit. So I don't believe in economic independence and also the mechanisms. So that's the reason why I think that the logic behind the AUKUS that provide Australian with the nuclear power submarines in a way that it could create the deterrence. And I think that it, anyway, it will be the issue, the problem in the region, that if you want to live in peace, but you have no arms, you will lose something. I mean, the Philippines learned the way very hard with the Scarborough Shoal. And I think that if you leave it open, and also it will invite the aggressions. I mean, dovish attempt is nice, but it cannot prevent it, from that not make other people also treating you the same. So I think that the logic of the international relations that will prompt, the reactive behavior. And I think that China is also smart. They know, they know that there will be the response, so that they try to work on with the gray zone operations, because they have the military strength, but they don't use that. They use a civilian power, so that to expand the influence in the South China Sea. But it do it to the extent that other country really worried. I mean, so that even during the pandemic, China expansions on in every direction that caused the country, and that triggered, the whole change of alignments and realignments. And I think that that unfortunately that something had been activated, and that one we will live in the uncertain area for a very long time. And of course, in that uncertain areas, everyone will be defensive, and everyone will be will do the self-help. They have the self-help option, so that they would prevent themselves from any type of contingency that will happen to them.
Thank you, Dr. Tan.
Can I jump in?
Yeah. What do you
Yes.
think of the Taiwan situation as well? If you could comment on that, that'd be great. Andy, go ahead.
Hello. Oh yes. Okay. So yeah. Adding to what Haido has said, I think we have to look in the historical context of what's happening in the Taiwan Strait. The current tensions, cross-strait tensions, are not the first time. nor are they going to be the last. And in the past, we have witnessed similar posturing, similar tit-for-tat reactions. Remember, in 1996, there was a Taiwan Missile Strait crisis, and actually, there was a lot more posturing involved there. America sent two two aircraft carrier strike groups to deter China from invading Taiwan. And I think a lot of this posturing is directly related to what's happening within Taiwan. If we remember, in '96, there was also a pro-independent president, Chen Shui-bian, if I'm not mistaken, his name. And I think the current government who's ruling in Taiwan also tinkers with the idea of pro-independence. So I think China is demonstrating political signal, sending strategic signal to America, rain down this government, tone down its voices, pro-independent voices. And unfortunately, we are going to see similar kind of military posturing activities to occur in the future. And hence, this is what why I stress about the operational deconflicting measures that countries should adhere to. And I think ASEAN can play a leading role in this. But at the same time, ASEAN can only do so much. Look at the legally binding code of conduct, on the South China Sea. How long has it been dragging on? And ASEAN Indo-Pacific, ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, to what extent has it addressed some of these operational concerns? And to my knowledge, comparing ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific with the recently released European Union Indo-Pacific strategy, there are quite, very different documents. And it is European Union, not ASEAN, that stresses explicitly the need for a legally binding code of conduct. I don't understand why there is no specific mention, specific sentences, statements that prescribe, that restrict provocative military posturing. That countries should not take. And there is a lot of opportunity in this area, but the question is whether ASEAN has the capacity to venture into this layer. Yeah.
Thanks, Andy. We'll move to Dr. Doody for a quick response to Andy's comment on ASEAN, and then we will have to try wrap up very quickly with one last question. Go ahead, Dr. Doody.
I think I just want to point out about the COC negotiations. I think that's taking quite a long time, but because it's very sensitive, I think the problem is quite clear, is how to define the geographical scope of the South China Sea itself. So from there is, I think, it's going to be very hard to determine which belongs to where and how we want to define the area. And also, secondly, we want to know that whether the COC is a legally binding document or it's going to be only morally binding document. That's also another view that people think that it's not going to be easy, because if it's legally binding, then is China going to be bound by this agreement, or also other ASEAN countries are willing to be, following this agreement for the future? So those are the things. And regarding ASEAN, to see the stability in the region, I think ASEAN is quite clear about the non-interference principle. So basically, even though they are playing the role of stabilizing the region, trying to keep everything toned down and cool down, but also the principles that they have, not to be interfering with other domestic affairs, is also one of the principles that's upheld by the states in ASEAN. So it's a mixed puzzle, but I think there is a way to deal with it. That's why we have negotiations. That's why we have diplomacy. That's why we have ASEAN partners and so on and so forth. So hopefully by having these dialogues, continuous discussions, just like what we have today, this will increase the confidence building, and also the trust deficit that maybe many countries have. We can also decrease it from time to time. Those are my 2 cents. Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Doody. I think just to really sum up, I don't know what we've been observing so far in this discussion is that yes, the negotiation of CC is taking a long time. And to what extent really does it have real value in resolving our competing claims? Nevertheless, ASEAN does play a role in maintaining this momentum in keeping negotiations ongoing. But while that is happening, we've got the reality of the developing incidents and strategic arrangements that are taking place in South China Sea. And this is really here where Dr. Tan comes in with his realpolitik statement that, if you need to defend, you defend. And Andy is saying that in the meantime, let's try hold the fort down by engaging in rules of engagement behavior. Let's look at cues. Let's look at crisis management resolutions. So I think what's happening now is really the best case scenario. So as much as we can, we are trying very hard to try temper the tone. And hopefully, this resolution in resolving US-China won't happen soon. Okay, Dr. Tan, go ahead.
No, my point is that you should not be afraid of that. US and China will fight each other, and they won't fight each other because they all have nuclear weapons. The only thing I worry about the proxy wars, because it's always happened in the past between the two superpowers, and of course that will be definitely in the peripheries areas of the major powers. And that thing that we have to think about that. And of course, I think that it's better to have also the collective voices against any type of attempts that will definitely just think of South China Sea, make us have to be worried, because if we stay silent, if we behave nice, it doesn't mean that you are safe from the aggression. So I think what happened over the last decade, I see that diplomacy, I think appeasement doesn't work. So I mean that that's time that if you don't stand up to defend what is right or what is wrong, and what you make your voice up again and kind of unlawful claims and actions, that one day that will happen to you. So we learned that very hard lesson in the South China Sea. And I think that of course some ASEAN should learn it, because it's their affairs. For some countries, take a free ride from that, and we also understand. So we be better to have more mechanism to cope with that issue rather than to leave it to ASEAN. And I think that ASEAN is not fit to that type of issue at hand.
I agree with Hai Do, and especially on the point, your point about proxy wars, and what we are seeing in Ukraine, Eastern Europe, in the Middle East. There will be more such wars happening, and I think it's the challenge is greater for ASEAN to manage. Look at what's happening in Myanmar right now. It's unrelated to the South China Sea, but it is a very contentious issue at the moment. How ASEAN can make sure the regime in power adhere to the 5-point consensus. And Singapore Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan already said that Myanmar regime ignored 5-point consensus. So what else can ASEAN do?
Thanks, Andy. Okay, so clearly there are limitations in the way ASEAN is functioning. So we can only hope for the best. What I'll do now is I'm going to scroll up the chat box a bit, and we've got 2 questions that are both related to China's developing infrastructure and also the Belt and Road Initiative. So perhaps I can just kind of go around. This will be our last question, just kind of go around and get like a 2-minute reflection on the Belt and Road Initiative that China is running across Southeast Asia. What are its impacts on maritime security? And also in relation to this, the building of infrastructure across sea lines of communication. This is closely linked to the finance projects and the loan relationship that China has with its neighbors, but also the claimant states. So what are your views on that, BRI and China infrastructure building and the loans with claimant states to support development in the region? We'll start with Dr. Doody, and then we'll hear from Andy and Dr. Tan. Also, perhaps after you give your 2-minute reflection, if you could share any closing statements or main takeaway points to the journalists in the room, that would be extremely helpful as well. Over to you, Dr. Doody.
Yes, thank you. So I will deal with the second question first. So I think even though China is building up many infrastructures in the region, including in some of the sea lanes and so on and so forth, it doesn't change the law. Because if you want to know how a maritime feature could be a part of a state, there is a law on top of that. So like we gain uti possidetis juris, let's say from our successor state, and then we will have the area that we are having today. So this one is different. It's inhabited, but still there is a law how to regulate the ownership of those. So it doesn't mean that if you are trying to build anything on top and then it becomes yours. Also, there is, I would also like to inform about a new legal regime that's trying to be developed by China, which is called the hybrid island. Maybe Dr. Do already heard about this. So basically in UNCLOS, it's clear that if there is a place where you can live, there is human habitation, that it can sustain human habitation, then that area could be stated as an island. The consequences of an area becoming an island is that you can have 200 nautical miles of economic exclusive zone, because that's what the UNCLOS said. But UNCLOS never mentioned about a natural feature, and then you build on top of that natural feature, becoming an island that can sustain human habitation. So they try to fill in that gap by saying that this is the natural habitat, and this is formed from natural, which is what UNCLOS wanted. And then now you have an island which can maintain, sustain human habitation, so it becomes an island. So they call this as a hybrid island. But this kind of thinking is not yet accepted, because it's unclear whether the UNCLOS actually regulate about this. And also there is no agreement between the international community, also via the United Nations, regarding the terminology of hybrid island, the concept, and so on and so forth. So it's still a problem. So after we have the arbitral tribunal in 2016, it's all clear that none of the features in the South China Sea is entitled to 200 nautical miles, which means that it is considered as what it was, whether it is reef, whether it is shoal, whether it is rocks, and it only allows them to have 200 nautical miles. I think for BRI, I will pass it to the other speakers, but for a small part of it, I think China tries to engage with as many countries as they could to have an agreement with the China related to BRI, because I think from historic point of view, that they think this is like also their trade route previously, and they want to make sure that this could still sustain, and they want to make a big impact here. And also BRI also relates to their claims to the 9-dash line, so it's also very hard for the Southeast Asian countries to accept. Again, you can only claim on ownership over islands or any maritime feature is based on the legal basis. You cannot do that based on historic rights, because historic rights does not have basis. Or maybe one question that we can question to China. When the discussion of UNCLOS 1982, Indonesia, before that, during that time, we were made of so many islands, and we have waters in between our islands, and we think that water actually divides our islands. But the thinking of the Indonesian government during that time is, no, the water which lies within the Indonesian islands is actually the glue to the other islands. So that's why we can, if you remember the so-called Juanda Declaration, and this is actually a unilateral claim that we had before. We made a domestic law on this, and then we bring this to the UNCLOS negotiations. And after that, with take and give, package deal, and so on and so forth, the UNCLOS have a provision on the so-called archipelagic state. So if the Chinese government, since the beginning, thought that this is the design that they wanted, why don't they bring this idea of the 9 dotted lines, 9 dash line to the UNCLOS discussion and make it legal. So the fact that after 1982 entered into force in 1996, we don't have that issue raised. And you know that China is not only a signatory, but also they have ratified the UNCLOS. So this makes another question, whether this design is new or they try to have this historical background to make their new arguments to have the entire area and so on and so forth. So, and where was China during the 1982 discussion of UNCLOS? So again, this kind of questions you can always raise. So BRI could be very important, but most importantly is to have the legal basis to all the claims that you want to have, including the South China Sea. Thank you, Dr. Asyura.
Thank you. Very well laid out argument, Dr. Doody. Do you have any closing statements before I move to Andy?
I think the last thing that I want to mention is that we need to keep on believing on ASEAN. I think we need to have a central role, as I mentioned before, in ASEAN. Maybe ASEAN is not yet as advanced as EU or any other regional groupings, but at least this is one of the means to maintain regional peace and stability. And in terms of South China Sea, I think I still have a big hope on the COC because this is the only main forum that ASEAN countries is sitting with China, talking about what we can do on the ground. Maybe queues, call rights, and all these provisions can be part of COC, but again, geographical scope and also whether the document should be binding or morally binding is again another question. So I think we need to keep our hopes high, and I think even though this is this case will be done maybe years after years, we don't know whether it's going to be done or not. Or maybe after, like Andy said, there will be a war first, then only there will be a solution to this. But I think because we have high hopes in Dr. Do with his publications and so on and so forth, I think we will have a solution in the future to get rid of the problem. I think those are my closing statements. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Doody. Thanks for ending on a positive note. ASEAN really is the only mechanism or infrastructure uniting all 10 member states and also the claimant states. So really, realistically speaking, that is our only hope for eventually reaching a resolution to these overlapping disputes. So thank you for that. Andy, over to you. If you want to reflect a bit on the BRI and also any
certainly. Belt and Road Initiative. I think to the extent that maritime security matters is China's initiative on the part of the Maritime Security Road, that is to help regional countries, other countries improve their port and shipping industries infrastructure. But I see China in handing out, in promoting BRI, China is not engaging in charity. So it is an economic initiative with political ends. And it's not just China, any international economic initiative, especially for journalists, you have to be mindful of the vested political interests in such initiative. And I think, from a geostrategic lens, the way China has been handing out BRI is, it is consistent with its effort to assert greater control of its maritime domain in the South China Sea and beyond. And as China's economy is increasingly reliant on the shipping routes, international shipping routes that I explained, so China's attempt to maintain security of these roads will also increase. And China has no trust whatsoever in the United States securing these shipping routes, because the more China is reliant on US Navy or other countries' navies for the security of these locks, the more vulnerable China is to maritime blockade or other forms of geopolitical harassment that I think that Asyura also mentioned, a blockade. So the question is, to what extent do countries, the recipient of BRI initiative, welcome China's effort? I think on the one hand, they should see, not see it, to ascertain China to keep such initiative strictly economic, business as business. Don't conflate it with political. So on the one hand, they can accept all this assistance, they can receive all this economic largesse. On the other hand, they should be very clear from the very beginning that they will retain their political independence as and when they are receiving this economic assistance. And this is the kind of what do you call it, situation that some countries, some recipient countries of BRI have failed. Hence, we heard the expression death trap diplomacy, because countries that receive this initiative, they have no capacity to repay the debt, and as a result, they have to compromise their political independence, to China. And I think the more countries who are engaged in this initiatives becoming more vulnerable to China, becoming more dependent on China. So at the same time, we'll see potential militarization or semi-militarization of the ports and infrastructure that China are building in order to sustain China's own maritime power projection, not just in the South China Sea, but beyond, like the Indian Ocean, for instance. Yeah.
Sandy, do you want to end it on anything?
Yeah. I think I end up with my geostrategic analysis of the issues. I think I agree with Dudi that ASEAN is very important, and to be honest, there is no other regional vehicle that can accommodate all this divergent interests and even colliding interests, right? But at the same time, we have to be mindful of the asymmetric balance of power that is going on, and how ASEAN can also accommodate, not oppose initiatives that they are trying to return the balance of power into a new form of equilibrium. So yes, power politics is disdained, power politics is despised, but at the same time, history suggests that history is full of power politics. You cannot, instead of living in defiance of it, you have to live with it. Yeah.
Thank you, Andy. It's a good note to end on. And I think also your explanation of how BRI is very closely linked to China's power projection really echoes our earlier discussion on whatever happens on land is definitely extended on sea. And things that we see on sea is really a symptom of greater problems that are taking place between countries. The case in mind, which I thought I should share, is that in Brunei, for example, China has just signed a deal to run the Muara Fish Landing Complex, which is a fisheries port in Brunei. This is clearly, as you mentioned, an economic initiative. But at the same time, it's easier said than done to remind countries to retain their political independence, especially when initiatives such as this really grants this particular private company from China with fishing rights to over 2,000 hectares in Brunei's maritime zone. So really, to what extent and how should claimant states balance its need for more strategic autonomy together with the greater desire to offset any economic recession that it may face, and the need to really improve its economy, especially for smaller claimant states like Brunei. Another claimant state we have is Dr. Tan, who please, Dr. Tan, if you'd like to respond to the BRI question, and then you can end with some of your final concluding thoughts.
Yes, I think that the BRI will have multiple implications for the region. And on the one side, that it could be an additional source of funding for infrastructure development for many countries in the region, including Indonesia and also other countries, and that will be interested. But also in the same time, that if they are not managed properly, it could become a source of liabilities, especially because I don't worry much about the legal aspect that you so raise. I think that yeah, I mean, most of the people would agree on that. But I think that there's two other implications that would be more complicated. First one is it build up the capacity for China. Of course, for the first thing is it defend the sea line of communication for itself. But when China can secure the sea line communication, they are not dependent on others actors. So that it may have the incentive, you know, to act assertively and aggressively elsewhere, because now there no ties exist. And the second one is a dependency that other countries, especially the small countries, small economies like Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, also Brunei, other countries would be dependent on that, so that it could lead to some kind of client state that for political purposes that we already mentioned. So I think that we have to look on that, but because it's very difficult to, I would say that, though I support the idea, but it's very difficult to separate between economic and also political purposes for each of any investment project. So we live with that. So I think that it's better for every one country to build up their capacity and capability on that, to work on. And finally, what I would like to, the final message, I think that media play a very important role in, the maritime security. I agree with Dr. Asyura that, it's affect everyone, but just that we don't know. So by bringing, different aspects of maritime security, from traditional one to non-traditional one, from fish stock to environment to sea level to plastic waste, to piracy, to the possibility, the concerns about the conflict in the region, the arms race and other things that will make the public understand the natures of the issue. And also if we have the public awareness on that issue, so we can work on that. Otherwise, if you leave it for only government, so there are many ways that we see appeasement, and also somehow that we see the quiet diplomacy also inviting more greater assertiveness and aggressiveness. By on that, by building up the public awareness on that, we also create different pressure for other countries to comply with international law. Otherwise, if the UNCLOS system will be collapsed, that will be a disaster for, because it's not only for Southeast Asian country, for other coastal states, also for China, US as well. So that would be fundamentally bad for all. So I think that that one is more people should be involved, and also that's the reason why I emphasize also I accept the invitation to be part of the class, because I think that the public awareness is very important in the fight.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tan. I think as we reach the end of our masterclass, some key points that we need to remember as we embark on these stories that we hope to do, that the journalists hope to do on maritime security, is that the environment that maritime security takes place in is extremely complex, but is also characterized by this underlying asymmetric balance of power, as Andy pointed out. But at the same time, because of this, we have infrastructure such as ASEAN that is trying its very best to rise above this, to maintain regional unity and keep the momentum going in trying to seek a resolution to threats that we see out there, including issues such as marine debris, while also tackling overlapping claims. But we do recognize that there are actors out there beyond ASEAN, beyond the Navy, beyond the Coast Guard, beyond the maritime militia, actors such as coastal communities, such as NGOs, that really need the agency and more capacity to do more for the sea and our maritime backyard. While all this is happening, we have to continuously address ecological threats. We are, at the end of the day, a maritime region. And so what needs to be done here is to really raise public awareness. In the meantime, as we move forward and band forward together, we should continue looking inward to build our own capacity so we can try and continue as much as possible to maintain that level of independence as we work and cooperate with our extra-regional powers and other neighbors. At the same time, let's strengthen regional collaboration and continue to uphold international law. I'd like to very much apologize for going beyond the stated time. We are 24 minutes past 6 p.m. But I would very much like to thank our brilliant guest speakers and the conversation that we had with Dr. Dudi, Andy, and also Dr. Tan. And also big thank you to Danny and also Adit from Kiniacademy for allowing me to moderate this wonderful session and for actually enjoying my Saturday afternoon. So thank you very much, everyone. I'll now give the floor back to Danny, shall I?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think we have so many people who's attended this session and hardly anybody left actually. And I'm sure that 2 or 3 that just left 5 minutes ago totally had to go. We didn't want to interrupt the discussion at all because that's really a big part of this what masterclass, what it's all about. And the learnings from this is incredible. And so thank you again to all the speakers. Thank you for your time so much, and your kind and totally straightforward contribution to the discussion. So for the rest of the participants, you've been great. We just a few more words. We have one more masterclass to come, and this another big, interesting, juicy one, which is on corruption, 2 Saturdays from now. Okay, we have a poll as usual. We'd like to have you guys fill it up for us if you can. This is important to fulfill the requirements of the funders. We want to continue this sort of masterclasses in the future, and today's masterclass is one of those good ones that will convince people to put more money in this kind of conversations, to progress conversations like this. So one small shout out to all the journalists. It was just yesterday I was in a talk that's got Maria Ressa and Stephen Tan of Malaysia Kini, where she received news that she won the Nobel Prize. So and she dedicated the Nobel Prize win to all journalists out there. So congratulations everybody. Thank you speakers. If you want to leave, you can right now. Meantime, the rest of you, please, Adit will be managing, has got a poll in the chat. Please fill it up. And thank you again. Thank you so much. See you 2 Saturdays from now. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye all. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
See ya.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Adip. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
So we have put the poll in the chat, so you can just fill it in. Otherwise, we will send it. So if everyone is all right, then what I'll do is I'll end the session here. I'll just give it 1 more minute. Oh, I think we have 7 participants, so we'll bring it to an end here. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you 2 weeks from now. Thank you.